It all begins with sunlight streaming through the large windows of a luxurious castle. A grand feast is being prepared with delicious dishes to celebrate a special occasion. All the servants congratulate young Isaac for being recommended to the Royal Academy at only 10 years old. His nanny brings a special plate filled with his favorite foods to celebrate that very joyful day. The boy is extremely happy and smiles gently as he sees the affection from everyone around him. He thanks his nanny while his name is introduced as 10-year-old Isaac von Goeth. Just then, a staff member named Hans approaches and hands a wrapped gift to the young master. Hans explains that he insisted on delivering the gift because saved his sick son's life in the past. The boy thanks the employee with a sincere smile and says he will accept the gift with great joy. But suddenly, his younger brother comes running in, calling for his older brother with great excitement. Little Jonas appears holding a lute and says he is going to play a special song to celebrate. Hans praises Jonas's talent and mentions that even the court musician called him a musical prodigy. Isaac is quite excited by the idea and affectionately asks to listen to his brother's music. Jonas is very happy with the permission and prepares himself, full of pride, to start playing the instrument. The little boy closes his eyes and begins to strum the strings of the instrument with great dedication. Suddenly, the melody is interrupted by desperate screams calling Jonas's name amidst the chaos. At that moment, Isaac wakes up with a scream of terror in the middle of the night, sweating cold from despair. He realizes he is in a dark room and takes a deep breath, noting that it was all just a terrible nightmare. The young man laments his own mistake with a sad look and thinks about how foolish he still is for dreaming of the past. He watches the castle under the snow and realizes with bitterness that he will never be able to return to those happy days. Firm footsteps begin to echo through the stone staircases of that cold and isolated place, cut off from the rest of the world. Isaac hears the noise and looks toward the wooden door, waiting for the arrival of his visitor. Lucas enters the room holding a lantern and a tray of food to wish the young man a good day. Looking closely at the young master, the man realizes that something is very wrong with him. He enters with the meal and asks if the young man had a nightmare because he looks very pale. Isaac puts his hand to his head and confesses that he ended up dreaming about things that happened 20 years ago. Lucas places the food on the table and advises the young man to eat instead of dwelling on those old memories. The tray holds a simple meal with a piece of fresh cheese, warm stew, and homemade bread. Lucas warns that after the meal, they will do the fencing practice that the young man ended up skipping the day before. Isaac looks at the food and remembers when he was 10 years old and caught a severe cold before going to the academy. That flu lasted 3 months and caused his father to seek the help of a wise mage from the Manhwa Tower. The mage then explained to the young man's father that the boy possessed an extremely unusual body constitution. He revealed that every living being is born with a mana channel and that energy circulates according to the size of that channel. However, Isaac's energy circulation was too violent and fast for his own body to handle. The mage warned that the energy channel would eventually break, and this terrible reality ended up happening. The mana accumulated in Isaac's body exploded like a broken dam and collided with external energy. The little boy began to cry in despair, while a gigantic explosion of mana occurred around him. The power destroyed the room and spread, seriously injuring all the servants who were nearby. Many people died on the property because the energy continued to explode without any kind of warning. The situation became unsustainable when the uncontrolled energy ended up destroying his brother's right hand. Feeling guilty for the tragedy, the young man begged his frightened father to lock him far away. He cried a lot, knowing he needed to remain isolated for the sake of all the people he loved so much. The boy asked to be taken to a distant and dark place, where absolutely no one could come near. He began living in that lonely dungeon to ensure that no other person would get hurt. In the present, Isaac eats a piece of bread and calculates that 15 long years have passed since that day. Suddenly, the silence of the cell is broken by a dry and worrying cough coming from behind the young man. He turns around, startled, and notices that Lucas is leaning against the wall, coughing very violently. The man pulls his hand away from his mouth and reveals that he is spitting up a large amount of dark blood. Isaac is in shock upon seeing the blood, for he knows this is one of the worst symptoms of mana poisoning. He grips the table in despair, understanding that his friend fell ill simply by having stayed by his side for so long. Isaac holds his friend and says that this happens because he stays nearby, ordering him to rest for an entire month. Lucas wipes the blood from his mouth and asks who will take care of the young master if he is not around, since he has no friends. The employee tries to calm the young man while stepping back and leaving the dark room slowly, trying not to worry him. Lucas smiles and reminds him that Isaac has already caused dozens of mana explosions in the room, and he has never truly been hurt by them. The young master retorts, worried, and warns that just one strong explosion could end up taking his friend's life. Isaac then orders the employee to leave immediately because he needs to concentrate and meditate alone in that place. Lucas smiles very tenderly and tells his young master that taking care of him during all this time was something very special. He says it was a huge pleasure to serve the young man and closes the wooden door, leaving the room in complete silence. Isaac closes his eyes and then ends up remembering again the parties of the past and the people who used to congratulate him. The young man sees himself once again sitting in the luxurious hall of his childhood, feeling enormous sadness for everything he lost. Suddenly, the festive scene distorts and fills with dry branches and pools of blood because of the uncontrolled power. He observes Hans's body lying on the floor amidst the blood while screams echo, begging for help desperately. At this point, the boy says that his friend has finally arrived and welcomes Lucas into the midst of that darkness. Isaac looks up and sees the silhouette of Lucas standing on the banquet table, completely covered in blood. The ghost of Lucas gives a terrifying smile and says it has been a long time since the last time they saw each other. Isaac wakes up startled and gasping in his bed, realizing he had another terrible nightmare about the losses of the past. He sweats in terror, remembering that Lucas truly ended up dying because of the poisoning from his violent mana. The young man remembers that this was the last time he saw his friend cough up blood, learning of his death years later from his father. On that same day, another terrible energy explosion occurred, and the young man decided to lock his cell definitively. He began living in absolute isolation, and the servants only left a piece of bread outside his door. Suffered lying in bed and thought that he should have kept his distance, so he would never have grown so attached to those people. He lamented in the darkness and believed that the best thing would have been to treat everyone with coldness from the beginning of his life. The young man thinks that if he had acted that way, his dear family would still be united and happy by his side in the castle. As many years passed, the untouched bread began to pile up at the entrance of the cell, showing the time that had elapsed. Even living in that terrible loneliness, he remained alive, and an extremely aged hand reaches out to take the bread on the floor. The boy from before is now an elderly man with white hair who eats the dry bread and decides he needs to look ahead. Time passed so quickly that the middle-aged man already had the totally worn-out appearance of a tired elderly person. He spent more than 30 years studying books of magic to try to understand and cure his strange mana constitution. Isaac began living in constant meditation to control his energy flow and keep his mind calm. In the dungeon, he reflects on his lonely journey and the trials he faced, isolated from the world for so many decades in a row. The castle remains covered in snow while the man faces the vastness of his own magical energy in solitude. After many years of research and isolation, he finally found a clue to overcome his mana problem. Isaac eats a piece of bread and wonders if something happened to his family. Since the materials keep arriving, on the study table are several papers with drawn magical formulas and some glowing blue energy crystals. Looking at his own reflection, the man notices the wrinkles on his face and calculates that he must already be 71 years old. He observes the marks he made on the cell wall during all these years to count the time he has spent locked up there. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stone stairs begins to echo through the dark prison corridors. A mysterious figure wearing a dark hooded cloak slowly approaches the elderly man's cell. The visitor stops in front of the door and calls for his older brother, leaving Isaac extremely shocked by the voice. The elderly man turns quickly upon hearing his younger brother Jonas's voice asking if he is sleeping. Isaac walks quickly toward the door and asks, surprised, what could have brought Jonas to that damp dungeon. Jonas, who is also quite elderly and has white hair, asks affectionately if he can enter to talk. Isaac clenches his fists and firmly orders his brother to remain outside for fear of hurting him with his power. Jonas accepts the request, and the two brothers sit on the floor separated only by the thick wooden door of the cell. The younger brother asks if Isaac knows that that day marks the anniversary of both their fathers' passing. Isaac demonstrates deep sadness at the revelation and asks his brother how their father ended up passing away. Jonas says it is a long story and asks if he would like to hear it. Receiving a positive answer from Isaac, the visitor smiles slightly and warns that he will need to start telling the facts that occurred 30 years ago in the kingdom. He begins to recount the terrible war of succession to the throne that happened between the first and second prince. Isaac hears everything with extreme attention and tries to understand the events that changed his family's destiny. Isaac listens carefully to his brother's words, while distant memories resurface in his mind. He remembers when the two were just children and used to spend time together in a very friendly way. The elderly man praises his brother's ability to tell stories and says he ended up losing track of time listening to everything. Jonas lets out a weak laugh and comments that perhaps he should have lived as a poet if he had known everything would end up like this. He adds that it would be difficult to work as a poet with only one hand, and leaves his older brother shocked. The younger brother bows his head melancholically in the dark hallway and offers sincere apologies to his brother. Jonas clenches his own hands tightly amidst the darkness and prepares to reveal what he really feels in his heart. He confesses with bitterness that his parents and he himself felt a deep resentment toward Isaac for having isolated himself there. The elderly man listens to those harsh words with a heart squeezed by the guilt and regret of his choices. But then Jonas reveals that despite all the resentment, the family felt a terrible longing for their brother. He confesses with great emotion in his voice that they all really loved him very much and that they never stopped caring. Suddenly, Jonas begins to cough up a lot of blood and says he wishes he had seen his brother's face one last time. Isaac panics upon hearing the coughing noise, and Jonas reveals that a monster portal opened during the battles. The brother asks for Isaac to live in peace while he falls, lifeless, to the floor outside the gloomy, dark dungeon. Tears begin to stream down Isaac's eyes, and he approaches the door in a complete state of despair. The blood begins to flow under the wooden door, and the elderly man deeply regrets not having left much sooner. Isaac finally decides to open the huge door of his cell to see what had actually happened to his brother. He is horrified to see Jonas lying lifeless with a sword stuck in his chest on the floor of that dark corridor. The man goes into shock upon realizing that his brother was mortally wounded and yet still used his final strength. He cannot believe that Jonas managed to talk calmly to him, even while having a sword in his heart. Isaac kneels next to his dear brother's body and says with affection that they need to leave that place. Darkness and cold take over the silent hallway. While time seems to stop suddenly in that empty cell, he carries his brother's lifeless body on his back and begins to walk slowly up the prison stone stairs. Isaac cries copiously out of sadness while questioning the reason why things had to end in that tragic way. He asks why his brother is so light and wonders how long it had been since he ate a real meal. The elderly man walks with difficulty toward the bright light coming from outside the castle dungeons. Extreme fatigue consumes Isaac's strength while his breathing becomes heavy amidst the intense cold of winter. He finally steps onto the snow that covers the ground outside the dungeon. Coming out of his many years of isolation, looking around, the man is faced with his family's castle completely destroyed and in absolute ruins. The courtyard is full of destruction, and a giant monster in the shape of a wolf lies defeated in the middle of the snow and rebel. Isaac extends his calloused hand and watches the snow fall slowly over the devastated courtyard of that old property. Since the ground is frozen, he decides to wait for spring to arrive so he can bury his brother in the family tomb. The elderly man plans to give Jonas proper rest and thinks that after that, he too will finally be able to rest in peace. Time passes slowly, and the dry branches of the trees begin to show that the harsh winter is coming to an end. With the arrival of spring, green buds begin to emerge on the branches, and a beautiful white butterfly flies across the sky. The white butterfly lands gently on the hilt of a sword stuck in the earth like a warm memorial. Isaac walks to his family's grave in the beautiful green field that is now illuminated by the sunlight. In his wrinkled hand, the man firmly holds a glowing blue mana crystal while looking at the three graves. He opens his palm slowly and begins to channel his powerful magical energy. Without any hesitation, Isaac elevates his power and creates a stable and perfect flame above his hand, showing total control over mana. He looks with sadness at Jonas's grave and asks if his younger brother is able to see his achievement. The man whispers that he finally managed to achieve the total control he sought so much during all his decades of life. After so many years of research, he overcame his unusual constitution and wonders if he can now rest. Without any more strength to remain standing, the elderly man's body begins to lean forward toward the damp grass of the field. He falls to his knees before his family's graves under a soft rain and wonders if he will ever be forgiven one day. Isaac regrets bitterly having taken so long to act and for having spent his whole life given over to despair. He wonders if things would have been different if he hadn't isolated himself from the world because of his fears. The elderly man closes his eyes slowly while lying on the green lawn, letting his life fade away in peace. Suddenly, a sweet and familiar voice begins to echo in his mind, asking if the young master had a bad nightmare. Isaac recognizes Hans's voice and remembers with melancholy that his dear employee had already departed many years ago. Suddenly, the elderly man opens his eyes and realizes that his blue-tinted young master vision is returning with great clarity. Isaac wakes up startled and gasping in a soft bed in his old luxurious room, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Just then, Hans's voice draws his attention by commenting that the boy is extremely pale and covered in cold sweat. Hans walks using a cane and asks with great concern if the boy ended up having a very restless night. Isaac is confused, wondering if that is a dream or just that classic vision of life flashing before one's eyes before dying. The boy jumps quickly from the bed and runs toward the room's window, leaving the loyal employee very confused. Outside, a nanny screams, terrified, asking little Jonas to come down from the top of a large tree in the garden. Little Jonas shouts back, saying he is fine, making Isaac widen his eyes in extreme surprise. He observes his younger brother having fun among the green branches of the tree with a toy in his hands. Jonas smiles from ear to ear and calls for his older brother from up in the tree, demonstrating great happiness. Isaac touches the window glass while observing the young and joyful face of his dear little brother. The little boy celebrates excitedly up on the branch and ignores completely the warnings of danger from the worried nanny. Tears begin to well up in Isaac's eyes, and he finally breaks into a sincere smile upon realizing that his brother is alive. He whispers to himself that all of that is not just a simple dream created by his mind before passing away. The young man realizes with total certainty that he ended up returning in some mysterious way to the days of his distant past. He understands that that long, lonely journey he lived amidst the snow and mana ended up becoming a fresh start. The young man decides to set aside the old pains to free himself once and for all from the chains of his tragic past. He fills himself with determination to become strong enough and protect the people he loves so much on this new path. The young man's gaze fills with an intense, bluish glow, showing that he will not make the same mistakes as before. On the hallway floor, the shards of a broken porcelain vase and some blue flowers show the damage from his mana. The maids clean the mess in the hallway and whisper with fear about when the young man's next uncontrolled explosion will happen. They comment that Isaac's temperament is becoming more sensitive and irritable every day because of the severe pain. Hans hears the gossip and becomes extremely irritated, saying he will will go there to give those gossiping employees a good lesson. However, Isaac firmly holds his shirt sleeve and asks with tranquility for him to let that go. The young man lowers his head sadly and comments that the employee's gossip isn't entirely wrong in the end. He adds that Hans should also stop visiting him, since he ended up hurting his forehead just by being by his side. The loyal employee looks surprised at the boy upon noticing the level of concern he has for his well-being. Hans kneels before the young master and guarantees, with great firmness, that he still likes him and wants to stay by his side. He says with affection that Isaac is just a boy going through a difficult phase in his life and that everything will get better. Hans guarantees that the current difficulties will be forgotten in the future, touching his young master's heart deeply. The man smiles joyfully while Isaac remembers with pain that that bright smile ended up costing his friend's life. The young man remembers that his friend ended up dying in one of the terrible, uncontrolled mana explosions he caused. He blames himself immensely and thinks with great sadness that he was the only one responsible for taking the lives of the people who loved him. Hearing Jonas's lively voice calling from outside, he understands that that new reality is his great chance. Isaac makes a difficult decision and looks with seriousness at his loyal employee, calling his name firmly. Hans responds promptly to his young master's call with a calm look, quite attentive to his orders. But the boy surprises the man and orders him very coldly to leave and never return to his room again. Isaac shouts with a furious look and commands his friend to disappear from his sight immediately for the employee's own good. Hans is left completely without a reaction and in silence before that sudden and aggressive attitude of his young master. The elderly man then bows his head very sadly and says he understands perfectly the order to keep his distance. The boy clenches his fists tightly, knowing that that cruelty is the only way to keep his dear friend safe. Hans begins to walk away slowly toward the room's exit door, leaving Isaac alone with his thoughts. But before leaving, he looks back and advises the young man affectionately not to try to carry all that burden alone. He says that sometimes it is good to trust the people around you and closes the door carefully, leaving the boy in absolute silence. Isaac thinks with strangeness that he does not remember Hans having said those words the first time and suspects his memory. To be sure that everything is real, he ends up giving himself a strong slap in the face that echoes throughout the luxurious room. Upon feeling the sharp pain in his red cheek, the young man realizes that that is really no longer an illusion of his mind. He wonders, intrigued, about what that lonely death of his on the lawn could have been if he is now alive and young. The boy looks out the window and sees his little brother Jonas playing happily among the branches of the courtyard tree. Isaac smiles, determined, and thinks that it doesn't matter if it's a dream or reality, for this time he will protect everyone at any cost. He knows that his main priority from now on is not to let another large mana explosion happen. He remembers that in the past, there was Zeke von Gothi, a supreme mage who suffered from the same rare constitution. Isaac learned about this ancestor of his through old family records that his father gave him. After spending many years studying these diaries, he discovered the only method to cure his problem. The great solution he found in his research was the creation of a powerful special rune stone. He engraved a complex pattern of runes on a magic stone to turn it into this legendary tool. In the past, his hands would shake from old age when attempting that, but with his young body, everything became very simple. To contain the explosions, his mana reservoir needs to handle the endless circulation of his magical energy. But in his case, the energy runs through his body at too violent a speed, and his reservoir doesn't resist. A normal person would die when this channel broke, but Isaac's body heals as if nothing had happened. Because of this bizarre regeneration, the energy kept exploding repeatedly like a true calamity. This rune stone serves to intentionally damage the boy's energy circulation channels. The damaged parts suffer constant impacts that, in the end, up generating new circulation channels. In this way, the terrible pressure of his accumulated magical energy manages to spread without causing accidents. However, the success rate of this method is extremely low, and he only managed to succeed shortly before he passed away. That little spark he generated in the past was the ultimate proof that his theory was finally correct. The young man takes a deep breath and wonders if he will be able to achieve the same success now that he has a new chance. He channels the energy, and an immense and bright flame erupts from his hand in an extremely powerful way. Isaac widens his eyes in complete shock while observing the result of his first direct magic attempt. He recoils, startled by the heat, and wonders where so much destructive power came from in such a small body. The boy carefully observes the effects of the magic. While trying to understand the changes that are occurring, a barrier of bluish energy begins to form around him while he tests the limits of his power. The magical energy runs through every vein in the young man's body, shining in a fascinating and frightening way. The boy's eyes shine in an intense golden tone upon, feeling the colossal strength of his mana stabilizing. He holds his rune stone firmly, while the flame burns around him without hurting his own body. The energy continues to flow through the magic crystal, which reacts by shining intensely in his small hands. The boy gives a relieved smile upon realizing that everything went exactly as planned in his theory. He notes with enthusiasm that his internal energy circulation channels have increased to 3 with the test. Each channel has its own flow, and now he is capable of using 3 different spells simultaneously. But suddenly, the boy remembers that his main goal is not to obtain this type of destructive attack power. His one and only true purpose in life is to prevent any new mana explosion from happening in the castle. Only 3 channels will not be enough for his plan, and he knows he will need to train his magic even more. He needs to increase the number of channels to reduce the stress on his body as much as possible and prevent accidents. But until this process is completed, he understands that he cannot let anyone stay near him. The young man observes the moon shining in the castle's dark night, determined to maintain his painful isolation. Later, Hans enters the room with a big smile, bringing a tray with the young master's dinner. Isaac orders his friend to leave immediately, but Hans just insists, saying he brought his favorite wheat bread. The employee asks him to eat at least 1 piece, while Isaac thinks the man never listens to what he says. Hans smiles in a friendly way and says he will just watch the boy eat and then will leave the room without problems. The young master looks at the lit fireplace and asks his loyal employee how old he is currently. Hans responds that he is turning 12 years old, making the young man think he is still at an age to be pampered. He holds the piece of bread with his fork and hesitates for an instant, remembering the good things from his past. Isaac savors the food and realizes it had been a long time since he tasted the bread made with so much affection by the nanny. Hans watches him eat with a tender smile on his face, happy to see the young master finally feeding well. The young man asks about the nanny, and the employee explains that she had to be away because her son caught pneumonia. Isaac stops eating and looks surprised at his friend upon hearing the name of his former nanny's sick son. He puts the spoon aside and asks with great attention if the woman really had to go back to her home. The young man reflects on the luck of the situation, remembering that in another family, a nanny would never leave her post. Hans listens to the young master's observations in silence, paying close attention to his behavior. The fireplace continues to burn the firewood calmly in the luxurious room, while the boy maps out his plans. The young master remains in complete silence for a few moments, demonstrating that he is quite pensive. He begins to move his fingers over the wooden table, revealing that he is analyzing a very serious situation. Isaac breaks the silence and asks if only the son of his former nanny caught that terrible pneumonia. Hans looks at the boy very calmly and gently, paying attention to his question. The employee reveals that all the children in that village ended up catching the same terrible disease all at once. The young man observes the starry night and suddenly remembers perfectly a tragic event from his past. He remembers that because of that terrible pneumonia outbreak, his dear nanny ended up losing her only son. That loss destroyed the woman's heart, making her live in extreme sadness until her last breath Isaac cries out of pain at remembering her death in the past and promises that he will not let the nanny suffer again because of that loss. He tries to concentrate and tries to remember what the truths behind that mysterious childhood disease was. The plate of warm soup remains untouched on the table, while the boy's mind works in search of a solution. Hans is surprised when the young master suddenly stands up and calls him by his name very seriously and decisively. The boy asks urgently what the exact type of monster was that the hunters captured in the village recently. The dark night with the waxing moon covers the entire forest that hides terrible secrets and dangerous dangers. Deer walks calmly through the snow under the moonlight in the middle of the kingdom's cold and isolated forest. Suddenly, the animal turns around, startled at feeling a strong magical presence approaching it rapidly. A huge fireball crosses the skies and scares the poor deer, which tries to escape the unexpected attack. The animal runs desperately through the snow to flee the great explosion that hits the trees right behind it. Isaac walks with heavy clothes through the forest at night and complains about having mistaken the noise of a deer for a wolf. He uses a small flame in his hand to illuminate his path while carrying a large backpack on his back. The boy continues his lonely walk through the dense woods, carrying a shovel and various travel equipment. He passes by an old wooden sign that indicates the path leads directly to the dangerous edge of the cliff. Back in the room, Isaac asks the employee about the type of creature that was hunted in the village of the sick children. Hans scratches his face awkwardly and explains that he didn't see it well, but that a mage from the tower bought the creature for research. He tells him that he peeked at the cargo and saw that the creature captured on the wagon looked like a huge spider with gray fur. Isaac puts Hans's information together and understands that the monster in question was a terrible threat to the residents. He recognizes the monster as the feared winter spider, whose characteristics are described in biology books. These spiders are not very strong in individual combat, but they reproduce too fast and form large colonies. The boy knows that the biggest threat of this monster is not its physical attacks, but the highly toxic mana it carries. Constant exposure to this energy causes mana poisoning, which acts like a poison that slowly suffocates the victims. In the present, the young man kneels in the dark forest to pick a rare medicinal plant that grows near the trees. He analyzes the flowers in his hands and concludes that the children in the village were contaminated by the mana of these spiders. The boy places a large amount of picked herbs inside his bag to prepare the life-saving medicine. He knows that in this era, people do not know the cure for mana poisoning, making it the perfect opportunity to act. Isaac looks at the plant and concludes that that amount of harvested herbs will be enough to cure the sick. The young man knows that if the residents take the medicine made with this plant, they will finally have their symptoms relieved. But suddenly, he realizes that this relief is only temporary, and that to save everyone, he will need to eliminate all the spiders. He thinks about asking his parents for help, but remembers that his father is on a military mission far away at the border fortress, and his mother is traveling across the continent in search of a miracle cure for his bizarre magical condition. If he simply waits for their return, the son of his dear nanny will end up losing his life to the disease. The silent night falls over the small and simple village where families suffer without knowing how to save their children. The silence of the dark night is broken only by the smoke coming out of the chimney of a small hut isolated in the forest inside the house. The nanny wears a protective mask and watches with great sadness over her sick son, who is resting in bed. Suddenly, the woman hears light knocks on the door of her house and turns around. Startled by the unexpected night visit, she opens the wooden door and is faced with a mysterious figure wearing a black hooded cloak in the middle of the night. The woman widens her eyes in complete shock under her mask upon recognizing the face of the person who is at her door. Isaac lowers his hood and says with affection that she seemed to be very tired, leaving the woman totally surprised. The nanny pulls the boy inside and asks, very frightened, what could have brought her young master there at that hour. She notices that the boy is very dirty and passes her hand affectionately over his face to clean the dust and earth from his skin. The young master accepts the affection in silence and looks at his nanny with a gaze full of affection and deep determination. Isaac explains that he came to visit her because she missed work, but the nanny pleads desperately for him not to enter. The woman warns worriedly that her son has pneumonia, and Isaac begins to pull some herbs out of his backpack. He puts a white mask on his face to protect himself and says that now there is no more problem in entering the house. Without wanting to hear excuses, the young man hands a bag full of medicinal plants to his nanny to take care of her son. The nanny asks confusedly what that is, and the boy explains in detail how she must prepare the homemade remedy. He decides to enter the humble house to see up close the state of health of his dear employee's son. The boy observes little Hinder lying on a simple wooden bed with a protective mask on his face. Upon noticing some bluish spots on the boy's skin, as it confirms that it is poisoning from magical energy, the young man approaches the sick boy's bed and calls his name with much affection to see if he can hear him. The little sick boy opens his eyes slowly, demonstrating much weakness and difficulty breathing because of the pain. Hinder whispers Isaac's name and implores with the strength he has left for him not to fire his mother from her job. He assumes the blame and says that his mother couldn't go to work only because he ended up getting very sick and weak. The young master looks with tenderness at the little boy and guarantees that he has no intention of firing his mother. He places his hand on the boy's forehead and says that she is the only one who brings him wheat bread, asking him to focus on getting better. Sometime later, a guide shows Isaac the entrance of an abandoned mine that the young man was looking for in the forest. The two walk to the dark entrance of a large cave that is completely covered by vines and leaves. Isaac asks if that place is really a limestone cave, and the hunter confirms the information with certainty. The young man hands a gold coin to thank the man for his help and warns that he will continue alone from that point. The hunter accepts the money and warns worriedly that several people have already disappeared mysteriously in that region. Isaac remembers that winter spiders prefer limestone caves and concludes that that place must be their nest. Before entering, the young man creates a small spark of light in his hand to start preparing for the worst scenario. The young man fills himself with determination, and besides, he needs to be totally prepared for the dangers that await him in the mine. He remembers that by opening new energy channels, he gained the capacity to use 3 powerful spells all at once. He enters the dark cave holding his flame and remembers the abuse of this magical energy can destroy his own body. As he doesn't know how many spiders are in the place, he understands that he cannot simply attack blindly and uncontrollably. The young man walks extremely carefully until he finds a quite rare plant growing on the damp ground of the mine. He recognizes the green leaves and the bright blue fruits of the dangerous herb known as ice belladonna. He reads in his notebook that this plant is used as an anesthetic for humans, but is a deadly poison for spiders. Isaac finds it a huge irony that a deadly spider would require the presence of a plant that is highly poisonous to it nearby. The blue sky of the next day begins to appear, showing that time runs fast outside that terrible abandoned mine. The young master lets out a long sigh of exhaustion after filling his leather bag with the poisonous fruits of the plant. He notices some red wounds on his fingers and realizes how toxic and dangerous that sap is for bare skin. The boy puts on his leather gloves and decides that all his preparations are ready to start the final attack. He begins to walk deeper into the darkness of the place, holding a glowing stick. Firm footsteps echo through the stone floor of the cave, while the young man advances with caution to avoid unpleasant surprises. The young man uses the light of his magic to illuminate the stone walls covered in moss and ancient webs of the abandoned mine. He arrives at the edge of a huge dark abyss and thinks that dying in a forgotten place like that would be a deplorable end. The boy concludes that the spiders must be down there and begins to analyze a safe way to descend that cliff. He finds an old rope ladder attached to the edge of the abyss and decides to test the safety of the old wooden steps. The young man demonstrates quite a bit of worry about the state of the old rope, but knows he doesn't have many alternatives to descend. He holds the worn-out fastenings of the improvised ladder firmly with his gloved hands to start the dangerous descent. The young man begins to descend step by step down the dark stone wall, while the light of his magic illuminates his steps. He finally manages to touch his feet to the firm and dark ground of the lower part of the cave's mysterious abyss. The young man lets out a long sigh of relief for having managed to finish that descent without the old rope breaking. Upon analyzing the new environment, he smiles confidently and realizes that he finally managed to find the place he was looking for so much. The boy illuminates the underground hall and is faced with a huge amount of bones scattered across the stone floor. He analyzes the carcasses of monsters piled up like mummies and realizes that all of them were completely drained of energy. Isaac crouches and picks up a long bone that he immediately recognizes as being a collarbone from a sick human skeleton. He laments the discovery deeply and concludes that that body must belong to one of the people who disappeared in the region. Suddenly, a loud noise of something moving rapidly amidst the shadows draws the attention of the attentive young master. Isaac opens his eyes wide, surprised upon realizing that the creatures are approaching him in the darkness in a frightening way. He crouches quickly in the mine while hearing the frightening sound of fast footsteps echoing through the damp walls of the place. The boy swallows hard and tries to keep calm, knowing that the danger is closer than he ever could have imagined. He extends his gloved hand upward and begins to concentrate a powerful sphere of bright fire into the darkness. The young master invokes a small flame in his hand to illuminate the place and prepare for the combat against the monsters. Suddenly, a monstrous winter spider emerges from the shadows and advances hungrily in the direction of the young man in the middle of the cave. He creates a ring of fire around him, knowing that the monsters are afraid of heat and will hesitate for a time before attacking. The boy decides to prepare himself quickly before the terrible creatures attack him in a group all at once. He ties up a piece of damp cloth around his face, carefully to avoid breathing the contaminated air of the abandoned mine. He takes his bag full of ice belladonna and prepares to put his plan into practice against the monsters. Isaac kneels before his equipment on the cold floor of the cave to start the next step of his strategy. The boy concentrates totally and tries to remember every detail of his ancestors' research on the creatures. He points his finger in the direction of the poisonous plants to channel his powerful, magical energy into them precisely. The leaves begin to burn intensely and release smoke throughout the hall of the damp and dark cave. The greenish and toxic smoke begins to spread rapidly through the air toward the giant spiders that are approaching. The monsters begin to recoil, startled upon coming into contact with the poisonous gas from the plant burned by the boy. Isaac observes the effect of the poison and realizes that the creatures are becoming completely paralyzed by the smoke. The young master smiles with determination under the mask and declares that the great hunt finally began in that abyss. Suddenly, the scene changes to an old bookshelf full of dusty books inside a large library of the castle. The young man appears sitting before a giant table full of reports and important documents for him to sign. He hears furious screams of demands coming from outside and stops writing for a brief instant of hesitation. The young man stands up and walks to the glass window to see who is causing all that noise in the castle courtyard. Outside, an angry man argues with the guards and demands immediate answers about the situation of his lands. He shouts with all his strength, asking why the lord of those lands failed to protect his own people. The man asks indignantly why the village was abandoned while the guards try to contain his fury in the courtyard. Disgusted with all that noise, the young man simply turns and whispers that the place is too noisy for him. He lets out a sigh of exhaustion and thinks about ordering the employees to nail wooden planks on those large windows, but he soon changes his mind and thinks that the best thing would be to transfer his entire laboratory to the castle's basement. He believes that down there he will have the peace necessary to focus exclusively on studying his rare magical condition. The young man plans to cover the walls with a rare mineral that absorbs magic to avoid accidents with new explosions. With a smile on his face, he turns and asks for the opinion of his loyal friend about that brilliant idea of moving. However, upon looking around, the young man realizes that the room is empty and that there is absolutely no one there with him in the room. Silence takes over the large office, while an expression of deep loneliness appears on the sad face of the young man. He bows his head melancholically upon remembering that his dear friend already departed from this world a long time ago. The young man returns to working alone in silence, while the sound of the pen scratching the paper echoes through the dark and cold room. He continues writing his magical formulas without stopping, while trying to push away the sad thoughts from his mind. Time seems not to pass while he sinks deeper and deeper into his lonely research inside that castle. The quill pen slides swiftly across the sheet of paper, drawing extremely complex and ancient magical diagrams. The young man's eyes show extreme fatigue due to the sleepless nights he spends focused on his magic studies. He continues filling the blank pages with detailed notes about the properties of dangerous mana energy. His gaze remains fixed on the papers, while the obsession with finding a cure consumes all his vital energy and mind. He sees himself completely surrounded by the darkness of his own mind and the regret of his past choices. Back to reality in the cave, the toxic smoke from the ice belladonna continues to spread through the stone corridors. Isaac remains kneeling on the mine floor, waiting patiently for the poison to take its full effect on the spiders. The young master laments that his mind always brings back these sad memories when he is left doing nothing. He observes that the terrible winter spiders have fallen paralyzed and concludes that the poison worked perfectly there. He knows that burning the belladonna is the best method to make the monsters breathe the gas and suffocate slowly. But the young man knows that the smoke is also dangerous for him, and for that reason, he used the damp cloth to protect his breathing in the mine. Next, he uses his own mana to purify the air in his lungs and avoid any harmful effect of the poison. At the same time, he compresses a sphere of fire and sends it through the tunnel to map the entire area around him with precision. He uses purification and 2 fire spells at the same time to stay safe in the deep darkness of the cave. The young master explains that controlling 3 different spells all at once is what he calls multi-channel conjuration with a cold gaze. The young man points his finger in the direction of his opponents and says goodbye very calmly and decisively. A devastating and bright explosion consumes the spiders, which are hit head-on by the power of his fire magic. He walks calmly amidst the flames that continue to burn the defeated monsters at the bottom of the dark mine. Suddenly, the young man notices something strange in the environment and stops his step with a very attentive and suspicious look. He realizes that all the surviving spiders are running desperately in the direction of a single point in the cave. The boy concludes intelligently that there must be some source of water or frozen lake in that specific direction. He speeds up his step and begins to follow the creatures along the rocky path to see what is really happening. The flames continue to spread through the walls of the cave, illuminating the dark and damp path ahead of the boy. He begins to feel a suffocating heat and realizes that the smoke from the flames is making the air almost impossible to breathe. He throws his heavy winter coat on the floor, determined to finish that mission as fast as he can. Upon advancing a little further, the young man is faced with immense ice stalactites that cover the entire ceiling of that hall. He arrives at an immense frozen underground lake where the dripping of cold water makes a constant echo through the stones. The boy begins to tremble from the cold suddenly and deeply regrets having left his heavy coat behind. He walks on the slippery surface of the frozen lake, while the temperature of the place continues to plummet. Upon lifting his head, the young master widens his eyes upon making a frightening discovery on the ceiling of the ice hall. He is faced with thousands of spider eggs hanging from the ceiling and shining in a quite disturbing bluish tone. The boy is horrified by the quantity of eggs and understands that the threat there is much greater than he imagined. Suddenly, a huge piece of sharp ice detaches from the ceiling and falls, breaking the frozen surface of the lake. Isaac takes a step back, startled, while feeling a frightening tremor shake the entire structure of the cave. The ground trembles violently under his feet, and the young man prepares to face the danger that is waking up. He swallows hard and clenches his hands, knowing that the fury of that giant monster is about to reveal itself before him. The young master observes the ceiling with the spider eggs while waiting for the exact moment when the great threat will emerge. The young master creates a new flame in his gloved hand to prepare for the terrible combat that approaches. He launches his sphere of fire in the direction of the darkness of the cave to try to illuminate what is hiding there. The fireball flies, illuminating the immense stone and ice pillars that give support to the ceiling of the abandoned mine. Isaac walks carefully through the frozen lake while trying to maintain balance and listens carefully to every noise. Suddenly, a very loud sound of heavy footsteps echoes through the walls, making the young man freeze in terror for an instant. A giant monstrous spider, much larger than the others, descends slowly from the ceiling in the direction of the young master. Isaac widens his eyes in complete shock upon realizing the colossal size of the creature that just emerged before him. The huge monster cracks the ice upon landing on the ground, and the young man throws himself to the side to escape the mortal attack. He rolls over the ice in a clumsy way, letting out a moan of pain because of the strong impact of his body on the cold floor. The boy stands up quickly, gritting his teeth, and laments the fact that his worst premonitions always turn out to be true. He observes the immense creature with ice claws and realizes that he is standing before the legendary and feared Queen of Spiders. The young man remembers that the queen possesses great resistance to fire and that her own body emanates a freezing cold. The sharp claws of the monster hit the ice a few centimeters from Isaac, who manages to dodge in a miraculous way. The young man moves away quickly and begins to concentrate all his magical energy to prepare a powerful counter-attack. He launches his fire magic directly against the queen's face, generating a great explosion of light in the cave. But the boy realizes that just a few common fire spheres will not be enough to defeat that monster. The only advantage he possesses is that the queen's giant body moves in a considerably slow way in combat. Suddenly, a strong dizziness hits the young man, who begins to sweat cold and feel the terrible limits of his strength. He remembers that he is in the weak body of a 12-year-old boy without any real experience in combat at this level. The queen crawls furiously in the direction of Isaac, making the immense ice hall tremble with each movement of hers. The young master takes a deep breath, trying to recover his breath while looking for a new strategy to win the battle. He closes his eyes for a brief instant, while a sweet memory of his childhood begins to surface in his mind. The young man remembers with affection when he used to eat the freshly baked wheat bread that his nanny prepared with so much dedication. He remembers that in that icy region, wheat didn't even grow, and that everything was thanks to the efforts of his nanny. The woman traveled every week to a city very far away to buy the wheat, only to please the young master. A soft smile appears on Isaac's face, and he fills himself with a new determination to fight and save the little one's life. Isaac holds his metal shovel firmly and decides that he will ask for the nanny to prepare a lot of wheat bread when he returns. He positions himself firmly in the cave, holding the shovel as if it were a true combat weapon. The young man faces the giant monster without fear, thinking that it doesn't matter if it's a queen or just a common spider. He throws his heavy supply backpack with all his strength directly in the direction of the creature's face. The impact makes the ice floor begin to crack violently because of the force of the blow dealt by the boy. Large pieces of sharp ice fly throughout the underground hall while the scenery fills with destruction. The colossal monster is taken by surprise by the debris and tries to protect its huge bright red eye. Taking advantage of the distraction, the young man runs with everything in the direction of the queen, wielding his metal shovel to attack. The young man displays a fierce look while delivering a precise blow to the weak point of that huge ice monster. He hits a devastating blow with his equipment, right in the middle of the hardened carcass of the feared giant spider. The violent impact breaks the monster's carapace, making a greenish liquid splash all over the ice floor. Isaac jumps with everything on top of the enemy's body to manage to deliver one more powerful and decisive attack. The boy gathers all his strength and exerts himself to the maximum to overcome the resistance of the monster's carapace. But the queen struggles violently, making the young man lose his balance and be thrown far away in the fall. He manages to hold on to a huge ice pillar to avoid sliding and falling straight into the cold lake water. The giant spider recovers from the blow and lets out a deafening roar of pure fury while swinging in the abyss. The young master grits his teeth, feeling his tired muscles, and tells himself that he needs to hold firmly onto the pain. He knows that he doesn't possess the energy to continue launching common spells, and that he needs a single fatal attack. The boy decides to change tactics and creates a flame completely different from all the others he has used before. He concentrates intensely to manage to compress all that immense thermal energy into a single point. The young man compresses his magic once more, transforming the yellow flame into a sphere of bright blue energy. With a look loaded with pure determination, the young man prepares the definitive blow to finish off the terrible queen. He advances against the adversary, delivering a devastating punch with his fist completely wrapped in blue flames. The queen of the spiders is hit head on by the attack and begins to be consumed by the boy's bright magic fire. Isaac observes the result of his final attack while trying to recover his breath after spending so much magical energy. The monster's colossal body begins to crumble into pieces and falls lifeless onto the broken surface of the lake. The creature lets out one last agonizing scream before being completely incinerated by the young man's powerful blue flame. The huge flaming body sinks into the darkness of the cave, marking the definitive end of the terrible spider queen. He tries to move but realizes that his arm is trembling so much from the fatigue that he can barely take it out of there. The young master loses all his body's strength and begins to slide in the direction of the cold floor of the cave. He closes his eyes in relief upon realizing that the danger passed and faints on the damp floor of that underground hall. Silence finally returns to the place while the boy remains unconscious beside the enemy's wreckage. He begins to regain consciousness slowly, feeling his body sore after that extremely hard battle. Upon looking to the side, the young man sees a beautiful blue mana crystal shining in the middle of the queen's burned carcass. The magic crystal shines intensely in the dark of the mine, revealing itself to be an extremely pure source of magical power. Isaac wakes up in a dark room and hears voices whispering outside the door about his disappearance from the castle. He recognizes the voices of Hans and his nanny, who seem to be quite worried about everything that happened in the mine. Hans asks worriedly if the young master really had the courage to go alone to that dangerous abandoned mine. The nanny explains with sadness that the village hunter only guided the boy to the entrance, but didn't accompany him into the tunnel. The young man remembers that after defeating the queen, he ended up hitting his head but managed to wake up and return to the village. Isaac recalls that upon arriving at the village entrance, he ran into Hans, who was walking from one side to the other. He remembers with affection when he ended up fainting from sleep in his loyal friend's arms as soon as he found him on the street. Back to the present, the boy opens his eyes in his bed and hears the nanny say that her son's scars disappeared. Hans smiles, moved, and comments that the young master always was a person of good heart, despite his mana explosions. The boy is left quite awkward with the compliments and hides part of his flushed face under his soft blanket. He sits in bed and calls Hans's name, immediately drawing the attention of his two loyal employees. The young man asks how long he had been sleeping, and the nanny responds relieved that he rested for almost half a day. The woman cries with concern upon, saying that the young master shouldn't have risked himself so much by going alone to the mine. Isaac apologizes, saying that he only slipped while picking herbs. Knowing that no one would believe in his victory, he changes the subject and asks about little Hinder, receiving the happy news that the boy is already much better. The young master smiles, relieved by the good news, and decides it is best to keep the secret about the mana toxicity. He thinks that if the scholars knew about the defeated monsters in the abandoned mine, it would cause a huge headache. The nanny asks curiously how he knew about the medicinal herbs that not even the castle doctor recognized, and the boy says he read it in a book. Isaac decides they have talked enough and tells Hans to return to the castle, even with the heavy snow falling outside. The boy warns his friend that if anyone finds out he left the estate, things could end up very badly for the servant himself. Before they leave, the nanny appears in the room, holding a basket full of fresh red apples for the young master. She explains that the villagers sent those delicious fruits as a way of thanking him for saving the children. The young master holds one of the bright red apples and quietly observes the beautiful gift from the peasants. Isaac affectionately tells the nanny to take another week off to care for her son until he fully recovers. The woman hesitates a bit and asks if that is really okay, as she fears the head butler of the castle might create trouble over it. The boy gives an amused look and playfully asks who said she's just taking time off from work. He holds up the apple very decisively and authoritatively orders her to make a delicious jam with the fruits. He takes a juicy bite of the apple and asks her to bring the jam along with some wheat bread on the day she returns to work. The nanny is deeply touched and moved by the caring and thoughtful attitude of her little young master. Happy tears begin to well up in the woman's eyes as she realizes how much the boy truly cares about her well-being. She then gives a warm smile and asks if he would not prefer her to make a delicious apple pie instead of the jam. The boy happily agrees with the suggestion, while the dark and cold winter night continues to cover the entire castle region. The next day, the sun shines brightly in the blue sky, marking the beginning of a new and promising week of intense training. The young master starts running through the castle's immense outer courtyard, determined to improve his body's physical conditioning. He runs with great dedication, feeling his breathing grow heavy from the immense physical effort of his daily routine. An entire week passes quickly while he maintains absolute focus on strengthening the muscles of his childlike body. During this period of intense training, the boy begins to notice fantastic changes taking place in his mana flow. He enthusiastically notes that his magic energy circulation channels have finally increased from 3 to 4 in total. This means his body has become more stable and that he is now capable of casting up to 4 different spells at once. He recognizes that running every day with such discipline was essential to achieving this magical control so quickly. He understands that using magic requires a lot of mental focus, and that a weak mind cannot endure without the support of a strong body. He remembers that the reason he got tired so quickly in the mind was because he was in the weak body of an entirely untrained child. The young man remembers that in his past life, it was the loyal Lucas who helped him train his physical endurance. Since childhood, he fondly recalls the friendly and tender smile of his dear friend, who always encouraged him to do his best in training. The boy clenches his fist tightly, determined to become strong enough so that his friend never has to suffer because of his mana. Suddenly, the sound of elegant footsteps echoes through the courtyard, and the boy hears the cold voice of a man calling him by his master title. The butler Schiller appears accompanied by an elegant man and announces that today is the day of the young master's regular medical check-up. Isaac stops his run and observes the 2 men with a serious and focused look while wiping the sweat from his tired forehead. The doctor bows very politely and greets the boy, attentively asking how he is feeling that day. He remembers that this man is the personal doctor sent by his father, but knows he has never been able to understand his rare condition. After performing the exams, the doctor states in surprise that the young master's body seems to be incredibly healthier than before. The doctor decides on his own to change the boy's medication, while the boy just watches as everything with a look of complete boredom on his face. The man elegantly opens his leather briefcase to grab the new and valuable remedy he brought especially for the treatment. He presents some glass vials with a glowing purple liquid and explains that this rare potion is used to stabilize mana. Isaac holds the vial and thinks proudly that his father really makes a point of sending only the best products in the kingdom for him. He knows that the panacea is known as the cure for all ailments and serves as both a tonic and a stimulant for soldiers. dangers, the boy remembers that the old translation, stating the medicine stabilizes magical energy, actually contained a terrible mistake. He knows the real effect is to speed up the flow, and that for someone with uncontrolled mana like him, it is a fatal toxin. But with his new training method, the boy understands that this toxin will be the perfect catalyst to open new magical channels. The doctor politely says goodbye to the young master and begins walking slowly back toward the exit of the castle courtyard. Isaac notices that the head butler Stiller is still there, watching him closely and in a very intrigued and silent manner. The butler breaks the silence and curiously remarks that the young master seems surprisingly calm that day. The butler recalls that the boy used to explode in anger extremely easily because of his constant headaches. The boy lets out a sarcastic smile and asks if he should have caused a huge scene and broken things this time too. The head butler adjusts the glasses on his face and quietly observes the boy, trying to decipher such a sudden change. The butler mentions he heard the young master cured the pneumonia of the village children, leaving Isaac startled. The boy asks in surprise how he knew about that, and the man reveals he ended up finding out everything by talking to Hans. The head butler seriously warns that if the advisory council finds out about this, things could get very complicated. He then decides he will pretend he knows nothing and turn a blind eye to the situation, just this once. But the man steps closer and firmly asks the young master to start showing more moderation from now on. The boy looks at the butler's serious face and remembers that in his previous life, he also never managed to get close to him. Isaac recalls with some bitterness that head butler Stiller was always a very mysterious and reserved person. He was a cold and rigid older man who always kept everyone around him at a safe distance. But suddenly, the butler reaches out to hold the medicine bag and surprises the boy with unexpected advice. Stiller sincerely says that if the boy cannot restrain himself, he should at least talk to him first. The young man remembers his brother revealing in the past that this butler had faithfully served the family since the former lord. Even after the tragic fall of his family, the butler stood firm at his post until the very last day of his own journey. He realizes the butler as a caring person in his own way and sincerely thanks him for the honest advice. Stiller quietly observes his young master's gentle smile and appears to be quite satisfied. Suddenly, the butler asks if there is any special reason the boy has been running so frequently lately. The boy quickly thinks of a convincing excuse to avoid revealing his true intentions with the training. He explains that the great mages also trained their physical bodies because the body is the true tool for channeling mana. The butler listens carefully to the boy's explanation and seems to be analyzing the early intelligence of that answer. Sometime later, in the silence of his office, the head butler elegantly begins to write a long report. He reports in writing that all verifications have been completed and that the young master truly saved the village children. He adds on the paper that the boy's future as a great alchemist or scholar is extremely promising. He gives a slight smile, thinking that this great news will bring immense peace of mind to the boy's father. Suddenly, soft knocks on the wooden door interrupt his thoughts, and he orders the person to enter the room. A castle maid slowly opens the door with an expression of extreme concern on her delicate face. The head butler turns to the door and realizes it is Rosa, asking what brings her there once again. The young maid nervously holds her own hands and says with a trembling voice that she needs to report a serious problem in the castle. She fearfully explains that several dedicated maids are mysteriously disappearing from their workstations. Tears begin to well up in the young woman's eyes as she appears to be on the verge of a total collapse from despair and fear. She says with absolute certainty that something terrible must have happened to her dear fellow servants. In another part of the castle, the other maids also start whispering among themselves about this terrible situation. They fearfully mention that 3 employees have vanished in just 2 months and say the place is not easy to live in. One of them remembers the danger dangers of the north, like monsters and bandits, while sarcastically asking if the other is going to run away too. The blue-haired young woman pushes back, saying Enid would never run away without sending word, because she was working to buy medicine. One of the male employees very insensitively mocks them, saying maybe she just got tired of taking care of her elderly father. The young women are extremely outraged by the mockery and furiously yell, telling the man to shut his mouth immediately. He laughs awkwardly, saying it was just a joke, and warns that he has a dark theory to explain the mystery. With an evil smile on his face, the man gestures with his finger and prepares to reveal his terrible thought. He whispers with conviction that the disappearances are directly linked to the forbidden use of dark magic. The maids are startled by the mention of dark magic and remember that, after all, this is a family of great mages. He suggests that to cure the young master's terrible condition, the Lord would be willing to try any kind of forbidden spell. The young woman covers her mouth in horror at the possibility of the girls being used in terrible dark rituals. He continues mocking them and says his bizarre theory makes total sense. Leaving Rosa extremely furious with the disrespect, Rosa yells furiously defending her lord and reminds the ungrateful man that the Lord even took in an outcast like him. The man becomes furious at the young woman's response, but suddenly firm footsteps silently approach behind the group. He turns around in a panic upon hearing a childish voice comment that this gossip about rituals seems very interesting. Isaac appears smiling with his arms crossed and calmly asks the gossiping man to tell him more about this story. Sweating cold with dread before his young master, the man begins to reveal in detail how all the disappearances started. He gulps and avoids direct eye contact due to his immense fear of facing a terrible punishment for his insolence. He stammers as he tells him that the first employee to mysteriously vanish from the estate was the dedicated maid named Hild. He adds that soon after, Claire and Enid also vanished. Enid simply went to church on the weekend and never came back. The young master listens to everything while sitting at his large desk. As the employee awaits his orders, Isaac fixes his bright blue eyes on the man and coldly asks if he has any clue about the reason for these disappearances. The man gets very nervous under the boy's intimidating gaze, but tries to cover it up by saying he really knows nothing. The boy calmly assures him he can be completely honest and promises he will not punish him for revealing the truth. He hesitates for a few moments in the tense silence of the office, while his forehead begins to sweat from pure nervousness. Isaac asks if the young woman's disappearances have any direct relation to him, and the employee awkwardly admits that it is obvious. The employee asks him to think of Hans, who was always getting hurt because he was the person serving the boy most closely. He laughs, mentioning that Hans himself always said he certainly would not meet a peaceful end serving the boy. The employee adds that the same danger applies to him, but realizes his mistake instantly and regrets saying it. Isaac lowers his head very darkly and calls out Bill's name in an extremely cold and frightening tone of voice. The man falls into complete despair and drops to his knees to plead for his safety, believing he will face punishment. The young master calmly asks if the man does not want to meet a bad fate and proposes he do a special job in exchange for a pardon. The boy gives a very confident smirk and warns that the servant will need to perform a secret task for him. The servant listens to the proposal in deep surprise, but feels immense relief realizing he will have a chance to save himself there. Time passes quickly, and the dark, starry night covers the entire vastness of that ancient and mysterious northern forest. In the silence of his room, the young master summons a highly powerful blue flame that shines with magical intensity. While manipulating his blue mana, the boy thoughtfully whispers the names of the loyal maids who mysteriously disappeared. He remembers Rosa, the young redhead who always took care of his daily tasks with extreme dedication and affection in the castle, and he also recalls the Cheyenne, who always kept her head down and showed great respect while serving the young master. He raises one of his fingers to silently continue controlling the perfect circulation of his mana energy. The boy clearly remembers the faces of his loyal employees and confirms the name of each of those young women to himself. He knows that 2 girls were the only castle maids who continued serving him after the great tragedies, volunteered to take care of his room and basic needs after Hans and his nanny had passed away. On the bedroom floor, shards of glass from a broken purple potion bottle show the terrible moment of despair from his past. The red stains dripped over the purple liquid, spilled on the rug, revealing how much the boy had hurt himself on that terrible night. At that time, the enraged boy ordered the 2 young women to leave his room immediately and let him be alone in his pain. He screamed out of control, ordering them out, leaving the poor girls extremely frightened by his sudden fury. The young master forbade them from bringing that useless medication again, taking out all his frustration on the servants. Even frightened by the boy's fury, the young redhead affectionately begged him not to give up fighting for his own recovery, but the boy, who was already completely consumed by despair, simply fired back at that word with extreme coldness and bitterness. He asked with a dark look what those simple employees could possibly know about the immense pain he felt in his chest. The boy questioned if they knew the terrible feeling of taking the lives of loved ones with his own cold hands. He revealed, crying in pain, that he had ended up eliminating his own friend with those hands, leaving the employees in complete silence. At that moment, the blue-haired young woman took a step forward, revealing a golden and mysterious gleam in her expressive eyes. She asked very seriously about this friend who passed away, leaving the young master extremely surprised by her attitude. The other maid tried to hold her back, worried about the boldness of the dialogue, but the boy remained silent, watching the moment. The young woman confessed with deep bitterness in her voice that if she had looked back, she could have saved her dear friend's life. She turned around and began walking toward the door, while the boy silently watched the employee's slow footsteps. Annette explained that despite it being a very special situation, anyone can end up making mistakes they never wished for in life. The young master listened to those striking words with deep attention, feeling that the strange confession brought some comfort. She stated with great firmness and seriousness in her golden eyes that this kind of inevitable tragedy happens to every living being. The boy remembers how that sincere and profound confession ended up serving as a true embrace of comfort for his soul. Back in the present, the boy deeply regrets not having asked his loyal employee more questions at that time. Suddenly, firm knocks on the door catch his attention, and the boy quickly extinguishes the blue mana flame with a swift movement. The employee Bill announces his arrival outside the door, informing him that he has returned with the information the master requested. Isaac opens the door and anxiously asks if he managed to discover the maid's whereabouts. Receiving a very positive answer, Bill explains that he went to the village intersection to question the local beggars, and that the girls' descriptions matched perfectly there. The young master becomes extremely focused on the report and firmly demands to know the exact whereabouts of his servants. Bill shockingly reveals that they fell into the clutches of cruel outcast traffickers under false promises of a better life in the South. The boy asks why they needed middlemen, and the employee lets out a mocking chuckle, saying he does not understand. He explains that the women needed transportation and security against bandits to be able to make that long journey. The young master listens carefully to the explanations and agrees, nodding his head upon realizing that explanation makes sense. The servant observes the boy very arrogantly, thinking that a rich child would never understand how the real world works. Suddenly, a concerning thought crosses the man's mind, and he begins to suspect the boy's true intentions. Ignoring his suspicions, he focuses on the main subject and tells the young master that things were not that simple. The man smiles maliciously and cynically states that he had to spend all the travel money just to make the beggars talk. The boy asks indignantly if he really spent 20 silver coins, since that equals half a year's salary. The employee tries to justify himself with an awkward laugh and cynically says that outsiders are much more suspicious. The young master says the money does not matter because his top priority is finding his dear servants quickly. He observes an important document on the wooden table and reveals that he has another special task for the servant. The boy gives a smirk and guarantees that this time the employee will receive a good financial reward for the job. The man accepts the proposal immediately with a big greedy smile, falling like a duck into the young master's trap. He believes that if he knows how to use the right words, he will manage to earn an absolute fortune from the little boy's naivety. He happily offers to guide the master to the bandit's hideout, knowing that huge profits require huge risks. The man continues to laugh, completely excited and confident with the promise of getting rich quickly, without realizing the mess he has gotten into. Suddenly, the scene shifts, and the greedy employee appears locked in a damp cell, wearing only his undergarments. He looks around in terror and notices huge skeletal remains on the floor of that cold and completely forgotten dungeon. The man completely despairs and screams with all his might, asking how his situation ended up this way. On the other side of the iron bars, the young master watches him with total calmness while holding his blue mana stone. The boy gives a slight victorious smile, showing that everything went exactly according to his plans from the very beginning. The location is actually an immense underground sewer of the castle, with channels of dark water running in all directions. The prisoner grips the heavy metal bars very tightly as he tries to digest his terrible defeat against the child. The man deeply laments in anger and wonders how things spiraled out of control so disastrously. He recalls that everything seemed to be going very well from the moment he managed to get the young master off the estate. The task of finding the trafficker responsible for the servant's disappearance had also been incredibly easy and fast. But suddenly, the mysterious dark-haired trafficker showed bizarre interest. When looking at the young man's carriage, he noticed the extremely luxurious clothes and the bright jewels the boy wore quite visibly on his coat. The trafficker was impressed by the rare physical traits and the exotic beauty of the little young master. The ill-intentioned man immediately realized the boy would be considered highly valuable merchandise on the black market. The servant despairs and yells indignantly, asking why only he was stripped and thrown into that dungeon. To his surprise, the young master did not suffer any kind of mistreatment or aggression from the cruel kidnappers. While the servant lost all his clothes, the boy remains with his outfits intact and focused on his blue mana research. Bill points his finger and desperately demands to know what the boy's real escape plan is for them to get out of there safely. He tells the boy to stop messing with that glowing crystal and say something right away to ease his immense tension. The boy notices the man has lost all respect when speaking to him and coldly warns that the formalities end right there. The prisoner yells that their priority should be rescuing the servants and immediately escaping that dangerous place. But the young master pushes back quite skeptically, reminding him that first they would need to break those iron bars. With total serenity, the boy extends his hand and begins channeling his powerful magical energy before the servant's eyes. The man watches the scene in complete silence and is shocked to see the blue mana begin to materialize right before his eyes. To the prisoner's amazement, the thick solid iron bars easily begin to bend before the boy's magical power. The servant's eyes widen and his mouth drops open in a complete state of shock as he witnesses the little boy's absurd strength. The man stammers in fear, unable to believe what he just saw. As he watches the young master turn his back on him, he changes his tune immediately and begins to plead in a flattering manner for the boy not to leave him locked in that sewer. He desperately warns that the place is a huge maze filled with armed bandits patrolling the corridors. Isaac coldly says he can deal with the enemies just fine on his own and sarcastically mentions he hopes the servant escapes. The boy pauses his steps for a brief moment of silence upon hearing the man give a desperate cry for help behind him. Bill falls to his knees on the damp dungeon floor in a gesture of complete humiliation and despair before the young master's power. He begs with all his might to be saved and guarantees he will do absolutely anything the master orders him to do. Hearing the promise of total obedience, the young master stops his walk and firmly halts his steps. He turns to the prisoner with a very serious and focused look, ready to dictate the conditions of his agreement. Isaac fixes his bright blue eyes on the man and mysteriously asks if he knows something important. The young master warns that he has already seen that man beg in exactly the same humiliating way in the past. Suddenly, the scene shifts to when Bill was tied up on his knees in the cold, desperately pleading for his life. At that time, the blonde-haired lord and little Isaac surrounded him in the cold forest while he confessed his mistakes. The former lord recalled that Bill was a bandit who only survived by handing over information about his own gang. He firmly highlighted that the traitor decided to turn his back on the family that welcomed him with such kindness. The leader coldly concluded that there was no longer any chance of trusting him and pointed his blade at his neck. The traitor begged desperately, but the head butler approached in the snow and warned that that was enough. The butler questioned if he truly thought the crime of selling the family's secret grimoires would be forgiven. Then, the lord's blade struck the man without mercy and permanently ended the traitor's journey in the middle of the frozen forest. Little Isaac observed the fallen figure and thought the man would be very useful if he was not so consumed by his own ambition. Back in the present, the young man knows that Bill used his knowledge of the underworld to track the servants quickly. The boy intelligently understands that the excuse of having spent all the silver coins was a complete lie. He remembers the criminal group to whom Bill tried to sell his family's secret grimoires in the past. It is the same human trafficking gang that will begin to spread like a plague throughout the entire region if he does nothing. The boy firmly decides that any threat against his castle and his family needs to be eliminated immediately. He pulls an ancient scroll from his clothes and asks the prisoner if he truly agrees to do anything. The boy warns that there is an important task the man will need to perform for him right there. In that cell first, silence and darkness return to the underground corridor, while the flame of a lantern illuminates the stone ceiling. In a dark room of the hideout, the bandits and kidnappers gather before their powerful boss to talk. The leader of the criminal gang savors a large piece of red meat while his henchmen watch him in fear. He takes a large, juicy bite of the meat, showing a voracious appetite and a rather intimidating presence. Criminals watch the scene with fearful expressions and beg their boss to eat well to stay strong. The leader holds his metal fork and darkly whispers to the empty chair in front of him, asking for someone. He stares at a human relic impaled on the table and crazily states they will soon see each other through forbidden dark magic. The man sighs in deep frustration and complains quietly about not having received any answer from the dry relic. He melancholically wonders if the soul trapped within those remains has ended up weakening over time. The leader angrily asks for his hot bath water, and the subordinate stammers, saying only the servants are left. Without warning, the boss extends his enormous arm and grabs his frightened henchman's neck with extreme strength and fury. He relentlessly lifts the man into the air, showing monstrous physical strength that leaves everyone in the hall panicking. With a look full of pure madness, the leader throws the subordinate to the floor without showing any kind of compassion. He harshly orders the injured man to get up and go prepare his hot bath if he wants to keep breathing. The leader walks toward the exit, and the frightened subordinate promises to get everything ready as quickly as he can. The henchman's lifeless body lies, stretched out on the floor, while the other criminals start cleaning up all that mess. They whisper in anger and complain about the terrible insanity caused by the constant use of that forbidden dark magic. The henchmen comment on the bizarre rituals they have already performed in the bath and think about using the maids for the next attempt. They know that if they do not cooperate, they will all face a terrible fate by the boss, so they decide to quickly get rid of those remains. Suddenly, a loud crash coming from the dark corridors catches the kidnapper's attention, and he stops his work in fear. The two bandits peek their heads out of the hall to try and figure out the source of that mysterious and loud noise, but they are met only with absolute silence and the cold darkness of their massive stone maze hideout. The kidnappers exchange confused looks and begin to feel a massive chill run down their spines in a terrifying way. Suddenly, their eyes widen in complete terror as they feel a crushing presence rapidly approaching them. A bright trail of energy slices through the air with extreme speed, preventing the men from managing any reaction. They go, totally paralyzed by the absolute fear of being about to face a monstrous opponent. The men look toward the ground and begin to tremble in terror upon noticing a mysterious silhouette right at their feet. A fallen enemy rolls across the stone floor next to an elegant boot, revealing the relentless arrival of the young invader. The fallen victim's eye remains open amidst the mess, showing the extreme ease with which the strike was delivered. The two survivors fall into complete terror and let out a desperate scream upon realizing the brutal end of their companion. They fall backward onto the floor in a total state of shock and begin to stammer without being able to utter a single word for help. Ak calmly advances toward the fallen criminals and greets them coldly, marking the start of the rescue. The young master holds a huge stained blade and calmly asks if they could bring him a little water. The criminal's eyes widen as he realizes that this small boy is actually the feared young master of the mage family. With red marks on his face, the boy gives a very calm smile that leaves the enemies completely paralyzed. He walks slowly down the hall holding his stained weapon with an extremely dangerous and menacing presence. The boy runs his hand through his silver hair and coldly orders them to bring water to clean the mess off his calm face. Back in the cell, the boy reminds Bill of his promise of obedience and presents the contract scroll for him to sign. The boy gives a slight ironic smile and explains quite obviously that this document is an absolute magical contract. He dictates the clauses, demanding unconditional obedience and absolute secrecy regarding all his activities and his magic. Bill panics when he hears that the punishment for breaking any term of the contract will be his immediate and unforgiving end. The young man warns that he will sign with his own essence to activate the magic and shows the knife, leaving the servant completely terrified. Suddenly, quick footsteps from guards begin to echo in the hallway, scaring the prisoner, who realizes danger is approaching. The boy smiles very calmly and quietly warns that their time is short and the decision needs to be made quickly. He stares at the servant and asks if he really wishes to stay safe and escape that terrible bandit dungeon. The armed henchmen sprint down the stone corridor to capture the intruders they found in the dungeons. With no other choice to survive, the man presses his marked finger onto the paper to seal the magical pact. The heavy footsteps of the guards approach the cell area, but the boy continues acting with total calm and confidence. The traitor closes his eyes tightly, expecting the worst, while the power of the magical contract begins to manifest. With a swift movement, the boy cuts the iron bars with his blade, leaving the guards stunned by his strength. The essence flows across the contract paper, finalizing the ritual and activating the powerful binding spell upon his soul. The glowing document absorbs the mark, definitively sealing the man's fate and forced loyalty before the master. A violent burst of magical wind surrounds the two, confirming the perfect activation of the powerful life contract. The young master gives a confident smile upon realizing his domination plan was executed with absolute success. The henchmen arrive at the location and yell furiously, asking who they are and how they managed to escape their locked cells. Isaac prepares for combat and begins channeling his powerful ice magic before the approaching enemies. He delivers an extremely fast strike that hits the faces of all the guards simultaneously with freezing shards. The enemies collapse unconscious on the stone floor without being able to show any kind of reaction against the boy's magic. Bill asks in terror if the men had passed away, but Isaac calms the servant by saying they merely passed out. The man is left in a complete state of awe and wonders how a child could be capable of performing such an incredible feat. The boy holds the beautiful glowing blue crystal in his hand, demonstrating total control over the properties of that magic. He simply answers that this is the true power of ice magic, which he has trained intensely in for so many years. The two begin to walk through the immense underground water channel of the castle sewer, looking for a safe way out of there. The boy guides the servant through the dark stone corridors, while holding his glowing blue crystal to light the route. The man praises the boy's magical skill and confesses that this was the first time he had seen the rare ice magic in action. The servant comments that this element doesn't seem very practical, but the young master firmly pushes back on his opinion. He calmly explains that the usefulness of ice magic only seems limited to minds that look merely at the surface. The servant listens to the explanation with deep attention, feeling that this child's intelligence is something extraordinary in the world. Far down the stone corridor, they spot another guard watching the area and decide to come up with a quick attack plan. The boy asks the man what is necessary to create ice, leaving the servant extremely confused by that question. The young master insists he guessed the answer, and Bill hesitantly takes a chance, saying he needs water. The boy confirms the answer by showing a sphere of water floating in his hand and explains how the modeling of the liquid works. He details that the water needs to go through 4 well-defined and rapid physical processes to transform into ice. He explains that performing all these steps at once requires a lot of mental precision. While the servant watches with concern, the lookout guard notices a slight movement in the shadows and quickly turns around to try and find out who is nearby. Without wasting time, the boy dashes forward and fires his ice spell directly toward the adversary. With a focused gaze, the boy prepares the final stage of his spell to ensure the enemy falls silently. The blast of cold wind hits the target with extreme precision and freezes the air around the opponent in a fraction of a second. The guard's eyes widen in absolute terror as he realizes his entire body is becoming completely paralyzed. The opponent collapses, totally frozen on the stone floor of the sewer, a victim of the boy's powerful phase, transition spell. The young master explains to the servant that because it requires so much concentration, this magic is not the best option for close-range fights. He silently reflects that if he did not possess his rare bodily constitution, he certainly would never use ice magic. Isaac holds a glowing ice mana stone that he retrieved from the lifeless body of the Spider Queen. He knows the rare item has high academic value and can be sold for a great market price. Bill questions the reason for using this complex magic, and Isaac replies that few understand how it works. The boy explains that the injuries look like regular trauma and that melted ice leaves no trace. With a cunning smile, the young master reveals that this trait makes the magic ideal for stealth. Bill is quite shocked and surprised by the cold, calculating mindset of that young master. The servant asks if they're not going to eliminate the guards, but Isaac says others would just take their place. The boy moves forward swiftly and states that sparing them is part of a much bigger plan. He strikes the 2 guards in the corridor with precision, while the servant simply watches without understanding anything. The boy reveals with a dark look that his true plan is to take out only one specific target. Heavy and firm footsteps begin to echo down the stone corridor, announcing the arrival of a new threat. Bill falls into complete despair as he feels the terrifying presence slowly approaching them. The young master confirms that the person he truly intends to eliminate has just appeared right in front of him. The muscular man with a scar on his face glares at the duo very threateningly and with immense coldness. The servant instantly recognizes the terrible man and screams nears his name in a complete state of panic. Bill desperately warns that he is the leader of the bandits and a total madman who destroys people with his bare hands. Isaac smiles confidently and says that makes things easier because it saves him the trouble of having to look for him. The young master quickly channels a powerful, glowing sphere of magical energy in his hand. He points his index finger upward and materializes a gigantic sharp ice spike on the ceiling. The immense, freezing projectile plummets from the ceiling at high speed directly toward the enemy leader. Niers watches the lethal attack coming his way, without showing any kind of fear or hesitation. With an extremely brutal and devastating punch, the leader shatters the ice spike into dozens of pieces. Bill is in disbelief seeing the strike undone with bare hands, and Isaac deduces he came from the northern tribes. The servant yells desperately, saying the monster is going to tear them apart, while Niers complains of a slight H. Bandit leader commands the attention of the 2 invaders, very imposingly in the middle of the hallway. The man says they will be perfect merchandise to complete his special dark magic bath. He adds with a sadistic smile that a mage like Isaac will be an excellent ingredient for the ritual. The The villain advances intimidatingly, while Bill begs desperately not to end up as a victim. The leader extends his gigantic, terrifying hand toward Bill with extremely lethal intentions. The servant cowers in fear and cries out that he is just an ordinary human who shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the villain's gigantic hand stops mere millimeters from the man's face, completely paralyzed in midair. Bill slowly opens his eye in fear and is confused to notice the enemy suddenly stop the attack. A massive ice spike pierces through the bandit leader's chest from behind, causing a huge mess. The servant realizes in amazement that this attack is the same spell the enemy had blocked earlier. The young master reveals that he actually controlled the ice shards on the ground to deliver the definitive strike. The big villain coughs and lets out a weak sigh upon realizing he has been completely defeated. The leader's lifeless body falls to the ground, and the young master tosses a knife right in front of his new servant. Isaac looks firmly at Bill and declares that from that moment on, he will be the new leader of the place. The young master stares at the man seriously and asks if he fully understands what he needs to do now. Bill feels a huge chill of terror and realizes he is totally bound to that boy's orders. The man grips the knife handle firmly, knowing he has no other option but to fulfill his role. He lets out a cry of determination and runs down the dark hallway to start cleaning out the hideout. Heavy sounds echo through the dungeons while Isaac walks back with an expression of total coldness. The young master reflects that anyone can end up doing something terrible they never wished to do. He remembers the past advice that this is a difficult trial that happens in everyone's life. The memory shows that the marks of the past battles can never be erased and stain life forever. At that time, the servant taught that there were only two difficult choices left to deal with that guilt. The options would be to drown in one's own regret or keep fighting for the lives of those who are gone. The caring maid held the boy's hand very tenderly to try and comfort him on that cold day. Back in the present, the young master stares into the void, determined to move forward carrying his destiny. He remembers that in the past, Annette said those words while grieving the loss of her friend Clara. Isaac decisively continues on his way back because he knows he doesn't need to hear the same advice twice. The carriage with the rescued maids begins moving quickly back toward the grand castle. Inside the vehicle, the servants stay together and finally start to feel safe after so much suffering. Young Annette watches her companions with a thoughtful look and a chest full of immense relief. The young master assured himself in his thoughts that, in this new life, Annette would not lose her dear friend. In a memory, the young maid enthusiastically mentions she heard the southern nobles are looking for wives. She explains that the southern nobles want to marry beautiful young women from other distant regions. The other girl is quite interested in the story and confesses she would like to try her luck in the south. She reveals secretly that there is a man who charges coins to take them safely down to the south. The young dreamer invites Annette and Hild to go along with her in search of a better life in the south. Annette turns down the invitation immediately, explaining she still needs to take care of her dear elderly father. Back in the office, Annette tells Isaac that after the two left, they never sent word again. Isaac concludes that this matches what Bill said and asks if she was captured while trying to look for them. The young servant nods her head, showing that the young master's terrible assumption is real. She tells him with great sadness that the two friends had already completely lost their sanity in the sewers. The young master listens to everything seriously and perfectly understands the reason for such enemy cruelty. He reflects on the cruelty of that macabre sewer and thinks about how it must have been a total nightmare. Annette surprises the boy by revealing that she actually could have escaped the hideout at any time. She explains in detail that the iron door of the cell where they kept her locked up was already quite damaged. The memory shows the young maid easily pushing the broken bars of her dark captivity. Suddenly, she heard a low cry coming from another cell and decided to investigate the source of that sad sound. Looking to the side, Annette came across her dear Aunt Clara locked up and crying desperately. immediately. She lowers her head with great sadness, thinking about what would have happened if she stayed there more days. The young woman's heart tightens, remembering that she almost made the cowardly decision to leave her friend behind. Isaac stares at the young woman's reactions with his deep blue eyes, analyzing every detail of that confession. She admits with a lot of guilt that she almost caused Clara's end, but Isaac finally understands the whole picture. He thanks her for her honesty and acknowledges that remembering that difficult moment must be very painful. The maid decides to reveal one more important detail that has been tormenting her thoughts lately. She says that when the bandits decided to set them free, she and Clara were extremely happy. However, Hild was trembling in terror and said she would surely meet a terrible fate if she returned to the mansion. Annette explains that Hild's terror didn't seem to be just the simple fear of receiving a regular punishment. The young man listens very carefully and guarantees he will personally investigate that suspicious situation. The young maid feels much more relieved by her young master's promise to help them with the case. She smiles and remarks that Rosa also grew suspicious of why they were set free so suddenly. Isaac is surprised and thinks to himself that those maids' instincts are extremely sharp. She looks at him with admiration and highlights that the boy was the only one who truly cared about them. The maid states that no one else would give the slightest importance to simple servants like them in the mansion. The young master stares at the girl in silence, touched by those deeply sincere words of gratitude. He breaks the silence and calls out to Annette very calmly, capturing her immediate attention. The boy gives a very gentle smile and confesses he is immensely grateful to hear those words. He decides to keep a secret to tell later, and the servant politely says goodbye as she leaves the room. After the door closes, Isaac settles into his velvet chair to continue with his tasks. A beautiful smile appears on the young master's face as he reflects on the discoveries he made that day. He notices huge hidden potential in her and thinks about teaching her to use real magic in the future. The day dawns sunny and bright, revealing the imposing stone structure of the family castle. In the courtyard, two maids start gossiping about the mysterious return of the servants who had vanished. They mention that the young master faced off against the head butler to keep them safe in the mansion. They laughingly wonder if the boy might be interested in them because of his current transition age. Meanwhile, the butler enters a storage room carrying supplies for the castle. In the bandits' hideout, Bill lightly pats a box of local supplies. He arranges the stack of boxes in the storage room when he notices other henchmen approaching him. One of the men respectfully greets him, asking if he has already arrived at the workplace. Bill quickly wipes his hands to hide his nervousness in front of his new subordinates. He complains irritably and orders them not to call him boss, because the true leader is actually someone else. He remembers when Isaac explained that new criminals would always emerge to dominate the sewers. The boy concluded it was much better to keep that criminal faction under his own control and management. The man grabs his head in worry, knowing he will be the first to fall if a rebellion occurs. Bill sits frustrated on a bag of supplies, trying to digest his terrible situation. He asks if the former boss used the gang members just as spies inside the large mansion. The man cracks a smirk as he notices the late Nears was not just a complete lunatic. The henchman continues the report, revealing that the former leader always used to prepare a special offering. Bill turns around quite confused and immediately asks what kind of offering he was talking about. The subordinate explains that every year the former boss prepared a special bride intended for a knight. He is surprised to discover the faction secured that hideout because the knights covered for them. A few days after all the revelations, Isaac is in his resting room in the large mansion. The young master channels his energies and creates a small burning flame floating over his right hand. With a swift motion, the boy fires the fire spell, which slices through the air, lighting up the entire room. Isaac tracks the path with his bright blue eyes, revealing that the fire was merely a distraction. Right behind the flame, a sharp ice point emerges, moving at high speed to hit the target. The powerful combined spell hits the bedroom wall with extreme precision, demonstrating its effectiveness. The young master tightly clenches his fist, satisfied to see the result of his arduous training. The fire and ice elements dissipate into the air after colliding with the room's defensive barrier. Isaac lands softly on the ground and analyzes the flow of magical energy still circulating through his body. He sighs tiredly but celebrates that his mana channels have increased from 4 to 5 after defeating Niers. The young man knows he needs to train his multiple spellcasting more, as he got quite lucky in his last battle. He reflects that his opponent was strong, but ended up defeated because he underestimated magic and acted carelessly. Isaac focuses his determined gaze, knowing full well that his path to the top is just beginning. The boy squeezes his hand tightly, taking on the responsibility of seeking absolute power with his own hands. He lies comfortably on his bed and remembers the stories his brother Jonas told him in the past. Jonas had revealed crucial details about the family's terrible enemies, who specialized in targeting mages. The boy closes his eyes, knowing he will not be able to rely on luck in upcoming battles against them. Under the immense starry night, he reinforces his promise to get much stronger to protect his family. Suddenly, a desperate cry calling for the young master makes the boy open his eyes in shock in bed. He sits up quickly and sees the maid entering with a basin of water, announcing that morning has broken. The housekeeper quickly orders the other servant to bring the proper attire for the young master. Still confused, Isaac asks the reason for so much commotion and rush early in the morning. The woman breaks into a wide smile and excitedly reveals the great news that the lord of the house has just returned. The boy's eyes widen in absolute shock upon hearing that sentence, which heavily stirs his emotions. His heart beats faster as he realizes his father is finally back after such a long time away traveling. In the distance, an imposing knight appears riding his black horse, crossing the large bridge toward the castle. The man carries a gigantic silver sword on his back, demonstrating the presence of an elite warrior. The scene shows several carved markings on the wooden wall used to keep track of the days. In a dark room, the young man with long light hair remains seated at his work desk. He uses a quill pen to fill the pages of his diary with highly mysterious notes. The door to the chamber suddenly opens with the arrival of the lord, who carries a large sword in his hands. The lord of the house focuses his surprised gaze toward the desk as he notices the unexpected presence of his son. The knight observes the person in the room in surprise and questioningly asks for his son Isaac. Two silently face each other in the middle of the room, establishing a very tense atmosphere. Isaac stares at his father's boot, while some shards and leaves fall to the floor, completing that mysterious scene. The count helps his son in the dark room, cutting his silver hair very attentively. The father says that if this is truly his wish, he will respect the choice without hesitating for a second. He adds with sorrow that he can guarantee everything will end peacefully and without any suffering. Older Isaac, with wrinkles on his face, watches the situation, showing a very tired and melancholic look. The count continues carefully cutting his son's long hair, who remains in absolute silence. The father asks one more time if this is what he really wants, and the young man answers, firmly confirming. The count emotionally hugs his son and says that will be the last time their paths cross. He touches his forehead to the young man's in a gesture of affection and a deep farewell before leaving there. The father mentions he will go ahead to wait for him and leaves the room, leaving the young man alone in the darkness. He asks his son to come meet him without carrying any regrets in his heart. Back in the present, the sunny day illuminates the large, beautiful windows of the mansion's office. Isaac reflects that this is the first time the two of them are meeting face to face since that tragic day. The young man sits down and greets his father, who is focused on reading important family reports. The count mentions he heard the boy recently helped the sick children of the Black Goose village. Isaac is surprised by the question, and his father reveals he heard the story from Schiller, but found it unbelievable. The boy responds quite modestly and says he just got lucky when it came to curing the children. He lies, saying he found the exact answers for that unusual pneumonia in an old book. The father lightly taps his fingers on the wooden desk, as he thinks about his son's account. The Count changes the subject and asks how the boy's body is reacting lately after his training. Isaac answers in relief that he hasn't caused any more mana explosions and that the doctor they brought in is really very good. The sunlight shines through the beautiful, colorful, stained glass window of the library, lighting up the large office. The two continue chatting very calmly and peacefully in the middle of the huge book room. The father stares at his son seriously and asks how things are going with the command and routine of the castle. Isaac takes the initiative and specifically asks about the news regarding the important border fortress. The Lord questions his son's interest, and the boy replies that one day he will need to go there to serve. The Count explains the situation there remains the same, with lots of monsters, knights, and a lot of fine snow. He adds by saying the only big news was that they stopped in the city of Bern on their way back. The young man remembers that the city of Bern is exactly the place that houses the dangerous underground sewers. The father points to his pipe and reveals that a terrible, highly problematic incident occurred there. He reports that a private soldier attacked his commander, and Isaac deduces the traitor must have been eliminated. The Lord denies it and explains that the injured commander himself surprisingly requested a military tribunal. Isaac gets very thoughtful, wondering why the commander took that suspicious action. Suddenly, the room's door opens, and the Count greets the people who have just arrived at the location. Two knights enter the room, respectfully greeting the young master and praising his growth. Isaac watches the two men out of the corner of his eye in a very analytical and silent way, trying to read their minds. One of the knights, wearing a headband, smiles friendlily at the boy without suspecting his suspicions. The Lord authorizes Fickle and Randolph to enter and politely dismisses Isaac so he can go rest. The boy accepts his father's order immediately and leaves the room, closing the large, fine wooden door. Upon leaving, he hears the voice of one of the men demanding the court-martial be convened as quickly as possible. The man insists the traitor needs to be taken out soon to maintain the soldiers' military discipline. The Count thinks he is acting in too much of a hurry and asks Randolph if he agrees with the execution. Randolph calmly answers that he only follows all orders coming directly from his commander-in-chief. The other man sighs and mocks him, asking if he really says that even after the captain ripped off his ear. Outside, Isaac walks thoughtfully down the hallway, trying to unravel the secrets of those two men with his bright blue eyes. He analyzes the facts, knowing the secrets of the border are involved. The boy remembers that the crests on the clothes of those two men indicate they are border guards. He intelligently deduces that the injured man named Randolph is the main victim of that false mutiny. Suddenly, rushed, panting footsteps running across the red carpet catch the young master's attention. The servant approaches, running desperately, and urgently asks the boy to come with him away from there. He reveals in total terror that a situation of extreme urgency has just happened inside the castle. The young master walks accompanied by his servant through the outer and isolated areas of the grand stone castle. The man senses something is wrong and asks the young master what is going on there. The man mentions he heard rumors about human trafficking in the sewers, and the boy replies that he already knows about it. He reveals that some people were accepting bribes to ignore that entire criminal situation. With a very serious look, the young master immediately questions who was to blame for this. The servant begins to sweat from nervousness, hesitating to reveal the identity of the people involved in the scheme. He reveals that the guilty parties are the Knights of Winterband, leaving the boy extremely surprised. The man adds by saying that recently the body of one of their allies was found at the sewer entrance. He says that all parts of the victim's body were cut, except for the pinky finger of his left hand. The young master asks what happened next, and the servant shows a lot of hesitation in continuing. Stammering heavily, the man confesses that something terrible happened in the early hours of that morning. He fearfully reveals that he woke up and found that very same severed finger mysteriously on top of his bed. The man says the enemies sent a direct warning message through one of their subordinates. The threat stated that if the bribe payment was not ready within a maximum of 2 days, the situation would get worse. The servant panics as he realizes his own finger will be the next to be cut if he fails. He begs for help and blames the boy for putting him in that dangerous position of leadership. The young master maintains a calm expression while coldly analyzing the gravity of the entire situation. He asks if anyone witnessed the attack, and the servant replies that there was an eyewitness. The witness reported that a quick flash of a sword appeared before their eyes, and everything ended in an instant. The only striking detail they could remember was that the attacker wore bandages wrapped around his head. The boy narrows his bright blue eyes as he recognizes that rather peculiar physical description. The boy simply says he understands the situation, leaving his servant outraged by such coldness from him. The young master begins to walk away slowly and calmly tells the servant not to worry. The boy guarantees with total confidence that the man will not perish, ensuring the protection of his life. He recalls that his father returned bringing the 2 knights who requested the military trial. On the way, they stopped near the sewer and eliminated one of the criminals to serve as an example to the others. The entire physical description given by the witness perfectly matches the appearance of that border knight. The young master clenches his teeth in anger upon realizing the audacity and betrayal of his own guards. He walks with firm, furious steps, thinking about the hypocrisy of those supposed border knights. He concludes that if it is all true, they are nothing more than an incurable disease that needs to be cut from the kingdom. The young master approaches the dungeon, immediately drawing the attention of the guard on duty with his footsteps. The sentinel is quite surprised and asks what would bring the young hare down to the depths of the dungeons. The boy directly questions him, but the presence of the prisoner condemned to the end for committing a rebellion. Inside one of the darkest cells, the criminal waits, chained by his terrible final fate. The young master firmly declares that he came there exclusively to have a conversation with the prisoner. The chained man opens his eyes, revealing an extremely sharp and intimidating gaze in the darkness. The boy reveals that his goal there is to confirm if the knights truly have a connection to the bandits. Before the bars, he asks directly if the man knows Niaz's feared criminal organization. The boy adds by saying he heard about their involvement with the terrible human trafficking. Upon hearing that revelation, the prisoner reacts immediately, clenching his fists with great force. He glares at the young master with an extremely dark and hostile look, maintaining absolute silence in the cell. The young master observes the physical details of the prisoner and feels that his face looks quite familiar. He asks if the man knows about the mysterious connection between the city sewer and his military commander. The chained man just keeps his lips sealed, refusing to answer the boy's questions. The man moves his heavy iron chains and coldly warns that he will say this only once. Suddenly, he lunges forward aggressively and grabs the iron bars, startling the young master in front of him. The prisoner yells furiously that he knows absolutely nothing and demands the boy get out of there at once. The boy continues to face his fury with total calmness, without showing any kind of fear or backing down. Ignoring the shouts, the young master calmly asks what the true name of that rebel prisoner is. He replies that his name is Carlson, and the boy cracks a smirk upon hearing that important revelation. The young master finally remembers his face and asks if he will continue lying, calling him Kyle. The prisoner's eyes widen in a complete state of shock as he realizes his real name has been discovered. He steps back in surprise, causing the heavy metal chains to clank in the dark cell. The rebel glares at the boy in deep astonishment and questions where he could possibly know that secret name from. The young man recalls that he learned this name when the bloody civil war of the kingdom reached its highest point. That entire terrible dispute for power began during the grand official succession ceremony to the royal throne. On that occasion, the second prince was defeated and decided to betray the homeland, allying with the empire to seize power. This terrible betrayal ended up causing a violent and bloody clash right in the middle of the festive celebration. With the fall of the kingdom, the people revolted and started a rebellion led by Kyle himself in the Civil War. He now pretends to be someone else and desperately asks how a child could know so many royal secrets. The boy answers with total calmness that he simply read that entire incredible story in a history book. This book contained detailed accounts and beautiful illustrations about the lives of several famous villains on the continent. The work described the young leader as a military genius, destined to become the seventh master swordsman of the world. Facing him in person, the young master recognizes that the description of his talent is very real. The prisoner overflows with impressive amount of mana due his extremely exhaustive training. He gulps as he tries to imagine the devastating strength this warrior will have when he truly awakens. In his past life, the rebel escaped the sentence and furiously demands the youth tell him how he knows all that. The boy tells him to calm down and reveals he also knows the man is the legitimate son of the legendary warrior. The warrior starts trembling completely from nervousness and asks in a whisper who that boy really is. Isaac questions how he served in the army and doesn't recognize the eldest son of the ruling family there. The prisoner asks if he came to finish him, but the boy says he doesn't care about the life of a simple mercenary. He adds by saying he has no interest in a deserter who vanished from the map for more than 10 consecutive years. The man doubts the here's identity, but Isaac says he only wants the answer to a single serious question. With an extremely serious look, the boy prepares to obtain the crucial information he seeks so much. He asks why the border commander would be directly involved in the trafficking of human slaves. The prisoner stares at the burning candle and states that, if the boy is the young master, he should know what happens there. He takes a step forward with his chains clanking, and says that is the biggest reason for him not to say anything. The young master crosses his arms thoughtfully, understanding the man's strong reluctance to cooperate with the investigation. The boy warns that the commander will blame him for all the crimes and turn him into a wanted fugitive. He coldly concludes that by acting this way, the prisoner will never be able to put his revenge into practice. The word revenge causes the prisoner's chained hands to start trembling with hatred immediately. He remains in absolute silence, just staring at the boy with a look overflowing with fury and resentment. The two continue staring at each other in a very tense and heavy silence inside the dark dungeon of the castle. The boy decides to turn his back and realizes that this man will not be easily manipulated like the servant Bill was. He leaves the dungeon corridor, knowing he will need to act in a totally different way this time. The young master concludes that his only viable option now will be to lure the traitorous knights in person. A few drops of water begin to fall and echo silently against the damp walls of the underground sewer. Two figures covered in dark cloaks walk very stealthily through the long, abandoned tunnel. One of the invaders finds it very strange not to find any sign of the henchmen from Nears's gang around. The hooded man points his index finger forward, indicating something unusual down the corridor. He notices in astonishment that all the iron cells that held the kidnapped slaves are completely empty. They complain about the delay in the bribes and the sudden summoning by the former bandit boss to that meeting. The invader opens a large, rustic door and wonders if the new bandit leader intends to cancel the deal. Upon crossing the entrance, the two criminals immediately stop walking and let out a grunt of surprise. The servant Bill flashes an extremely forced and trembling smile while trying to hide all his panic. Trembling with immense fear, the man gestures with his hands and politely invites the two guests to enter. One of the disguised knights grows suspicious right away upon seeing one of Nears's henchmen dressed as a mansion servant. He notices the man is unarmed, but also notes that the lackey's legs won't stop shaking from nervousness. The two criminals exchange a quick, silent, conspiratorial look, deciding to move forward into the dark room. They draw their sharp metal swords hidden beneath their cloaks and enter the secret hideout for good. The hooded knight enters the dark chamber with a cold gaze, trying to identify who is hidden in the shadows. Before them, a mysterious figure remains seated with crossed arms at the head of a large wooden table. He asks mockingly if that person there is Nears's new boss, who called them without providing a proper reception. The man threatens, saying the supposed leader must think he has 7 lives to have the audacity to treat them this way. The mysterious figure asks a question, leaving the 2 invaders completely paralyzed with shock on the spot. The men go on high alert as they instantly realize that calm voice belongs to a small child. With his face illuminated by the candle, the boy calmly asks the reason they acted in such a violent manner. One of the knights begins to sweat cold under his hood as he perfectly recognizes who is sitting before them. All of a sudden, one of the men drops to his knees on the floor, leaving his guard companion confused. The standing soldier questions the action, but the kneeling warrior desperately yells, ordering him to bow. He asks if his ally is a fool for not recognizing the grand and important identity of the boy present there. The knight lowers his head in deep servitude, declaring it is an immense honor to meet him again in that place. The youth rises calmly with a smirk and asks if they would care to accept something to drink by calling them by their real names. The young master makes Sir Fickle and Sir Randolph tremble with dread in the darkness. Everything had begun a little earlier, in that isolated cabin in the middle of the freezing forest. Inside, one of the men enthusiastically held the bag full of coins they had collected. He praised the late Nier's skill for getting so much money so easily, holding a gold coin. The others celebrated that it would guarantee food and firewood for the whole month. At that, his companion said they could even trade their old swords and still have some left over. He starts throwing the gold coins to his partner while laughing at their luck that night. But their joy is short-lived when heavy footsteps and a mysterious boot appear at the entrance. A voice from the shadows orders them to stop immediately, startling the 2 criminals. Isaac appears before them, revealing that he had just listened to the entire conversation about the money. The man tries to hide the bag of coins on the table in a desperate and useless gesture of panic. With a threatening look, the young master questions what exactly they thought they were doing. Back in the present, Isaac calmly drinks his tea while listening to the explanation from the 2 guards. Sitting at the head of the table, the young heir accepts that they truly had their reasons for that. They say that Commander Gothi is a very strict man and acts only as the shield of the North. They admired his honor, but they couldn't simply watch their soldiers suffer from starvation. With no way out, they decided to extort the bandits to make up for the lack of resources and protect the region. Fickle eagerly agrees and says that was exactly their plan all along. The young heir listens to everything with his eyes closed and prepares to give his final verdict. He opens his striking blue eyes and coldly pronounces the names of Fickle and Randolph. To the complete despair of the 2 knights, Isaac decrees that the penalty for their crime is their definitive end. The boy warns that they will be handed over to a military court because his father would give the exact same verdict. Fickle loses his patience and slams the table, asking if the boy still hasn't understood their pain. The angry soldier looks back and concludes that a brat like him would never comprehend their suffering. He asks if Isaac has ever felt extreme hunger or seen his allies fall to the cold without decent weapons. The young master stares at him without any emotion and answers very directly that he has never been through that. Isaac stands up and says that Fickle is just piling up empty excuses for his mistakes. The heir questions the kidnapping of civilians, and Fickle quickly blames Niers for having acted alone. The boy remains standing, staring at the traitors with an extremely severe and dominant look. Isaac asks if he really believes he hasn't crossed the same unforgivable line as the bandits. Fickle becomes completely furious when he realizes that the young heir will have absolutely no mercy on them. He clenches his fist in anger, noting that he was a fool to expect any understanding from that boy. The traitor orders Randolph to stand up so they can fight like Gothi's true swords. With a fierce look, Fickle draws his metallic blade, willing to eliminate the young master right there, and then he points the sharp sword at Isaac and guarantees he will strike down anyone who gets in his way. Randolph panics at his partner's insane attitude and begs him to think it over. Fickle replies that the commander has another hair and that they must eliminate this threat immediately. While tension takes over the room, the boy continues to observe the reaction of the two coldly. At that moment, Randolph draws his sword and a powerful blue spiritual energy begins to wrap around the metal. The knight steps forward with heavy feet as he channels his spiritual aura through his boots. The young master follows the soldier's movements and seems slightly curious about the situation. Fickle smiles, believing his partner has finally decided to help him take the boy out. He focuses all his attention on attacking Isaac, without imagining what his companion was about to do. Randolph looks at his friend with deep sadness and wonders how things ever got to that point. He nostalgically recalls that, in the beginning, all their actions were genuinely for the good of Goeth, but he realizes that the path they followed has become far too dark and hesitates to use his blade. The soldier lowers his head, wondering if they can still call that an act of loyalty. Randolph bites his own lip hard as he makes an extremely difficult decision about his destiny. He takes a stance against his friend and asks if he doesn't remember the oath they made in the past. The man recalls the pact, where they said if one of them was the sword, the other would be the shield. He decides to surrender and ends up with his hands tied, accepting his judgment in an honorable way. Randolph remembers Carlson's advice about how a perfect sword that cuts everything without breaking is a masterpiece. But he understands that the situation changes completely when the warrior deviates from his original path. He warns that if this masterpiece gains a will of its own, it ends up becoming a terrible, wicked sword. Fickle is in complete shock at being blocked by his ally and asks what he thinks he is doing. The two brothers, in arms, begin to exchange intense blows while their blades clash with force. Randolph confesses that he was only able to understand the painful truth after he lost his ear. He yells at Fickle that the prisoner Carlson was absolutely right about the corruption that was consuming them. Fickle breaks into a cold sweat when he realizes that his partner from so many battles has truly turned against him. He tries to convince Randolph to stop that madness, warning that the young hare is going to take his head. Randolph replies firmly that if that happens, it will only be the tragic fate they brought upon themselves. He decides to come clean once and for all and throws the request truths in his former partner's face. While they exchange fierce attacks, he throws it in Fickle's face that money was never just for the soldiers. He asks if the traitor really spent all that fortune thinking exclusively of the territory's well-being. The fight ends in a brutal way, and silence reigns in the room once again with the end of the fatal clash. Back in the dungeon, Randolph explains to Isaac that this was the reason Carlson decided to act in the past. The knight reveals that they only intended to silence the prisoner, but ended up defeated by him. Isaac listens to everything calmly and concludes with disdain that they simply lost the fight against the warrior. The soldier admits that Carlson could have ended them right then and there if he wanted to. Instead, he just sliced off Randolph's ear as a lesson and let himself be arrested without putting up any resistance. With his arms crossed, Isaac asks if he avoided Carlson's punishment just because he felt guilty. Randolph lowers his head sadly and remains in absolute silence. When confronted with this truth, he trembles nervously and confesses in a low voice that he is extremely worried about the future that awaits him. The man wonders what will happen to his beloved family if this whole story of betrayal comes to light. Isaac looks at him seriously and says that the knight probably understands the consequences better than anyone. Randolph shudders in panic at the boy's coldness and feels the terrible weight of his past choices. In the corner of the room, the servant Bill holds the bag with Fickle's remains and desperately thinks about escaping from there. Isaac keeps his eyes fixed on the prisoner and begins to come up with a strategic plan to resolve the situation. He calls for Sir Randolph in an authoritative way that makes the knight pay immediate attention. The young hare asks directly if he would be willing to pay for his serious crimes in another way. Randolph raises his head in surprise when he realizes that the boy is offering him a valuable chance at redemption. With the knight's acceptance, the official story of that incident begins to be rewritten by the young master. The new version says that Randolph and Fickle only dealt with Nears to get urgent supplies for the troop. The report points out that Fickle acted alone out of greed, leading the smuggling ring and kidnapping the mansion's maids. It also says that when the plan failed, the traitor tried to sell Isaac to foreigners and use the boy as a hostage. But the evil plan was stopped in time thanks to the heroic action of one person in particular. The official report declares that the loyal Knight Randolph was the one who saved the heir and stopped the criminal. With that, every single one of the terrible sins committed fell exclusively on the back of the late Fickle. The traitor's body is made a public example in the town square in front of the local citizens to serve as a warning to all. Wearing a dark hood to hide his face, Randolph watches the punishment of his former companion. The knight walks silently through the village streets, under the watchful eyes of the people around him. Later, Isaac meets with his father in the luxurious and imposing living room of the Go the family mansion. While drinking his warm tea, the boy reflects that the extreme lack of resources was the real reason for the betrayal. The terrible lack of basic supplies is the harsh and cruel reality that House Gothi has to face every day. They protect the northern border and receive an annual tax from the royals that serves as their main source of income. However, the big problem is that this royal tax has been dropping drastically with each passing year. Even so, House Gothi cannot complain to the king, nor can they try to get rich independently. All this misery happens due to the actions of Zeke von Goth, the mad mage who burned the imperial capital in the past. This cursed legacy of his ancestor destroyed his family's reputation and glory forever. Since no one could defeat the mad mage, the king bowed to the emperor and Zeke was finally taken down by the knights. After that, the kingdom became a vassal state and House Goth lost its ducal title, becoming just a county. Being exiled in that desolate northern land, any attempt to accumulate wealth would be viewed with extreme suspicion. The royals would see this as treason, making the maintenance of the current system the safest path for survival. However, Isaac calmly reflects that this hasty conclusion might be a huge mistake on their part. The boy warns his father and the advisor that this old line of reasoning is just a baseless assumption. The count widens his eyes in surprise upon realizing the boldness and great intelligence behind his son's words. Isaac explains that the kingdom's finances weaken every year, and that the shield tax will continue to fall along with them. He asks if the king would really be suspicious, or just relieved to see House Goth becoming self-sufficient. The young master decides to come clean and exposes the Rawast truth about their territory's real financial problem. Isaac states that the real obstacle was never a royal ban, but rather the fact that they never found a solution. Schiller intervenes, remembering that they are completely surrounded by infertile lands and dangerous enemy forces. The Count reflects deeply on the points raised by his son, while resting his chin in his hands. He admits that the boy's ideas make sense, but demands that he present something concrete to solve the crisis. The head of the family crosses his fingers and warns that such a proposal will only have value with a viable action plan. With a piercing look, the man directly asks if the boy is capable of providing this saving answer. Isaac keeps his posture firm and his bright blue eyes show that he already knows exactly what to do. The young hare reaches out his hand and says with total conviction that they must start acting without further delay. The boy reveals that the crucial first step is to definitively cut all ties with the old church. He explains that the church's ascetic doctrines prevent the family from prospering and generating real wealth. The Count tenses up at the bold proposal and warns that the Vatican won't just sit back and accept this rebellion. The boy clenches his fist with determination and agrees that this is exactly why they need a perfect justification. Isaac flashes a cunning smile and guarantees he already has the ideal method to create this undeniable alibi. Faced with that impressive revelation, the Count turns to Schiller seeking wise counsel. The leader takes a sip of tea and wonders if all those brilliant ideas really came from Isaac's mind. Schiller praises the boy with admiration, finding it incredible that he has so much intellect even while struggling with mana. Impressed with the way things are going, the Count gets up from the armchair to follow his son's next steps. Through the mansion window, he watches Isaac calmly walking through the garden next to his new alley. The boy walks with Randolph while discussing preparations to permanently weaken the church's influence. The Count watches the scene from afar with a thoughtful look, proud of his hair's early maturity. He rests his hand against the cold glass of the window as he reflects on the promising destiny that awaits the family. Schiller maintains his usual elegant composure as he follows his lord's silent thoughts. The conversation between father and son ends, leaving in the air the certainty that great changes are about to happen. The scene gradually darkens, marking the time transition to the story's next crucial events. The cold night soon falls over the region while the strong wind scatters dry leaves through the silent forest. A few days later, south of the city of Bern, a mysterious carriage advances down the road toward a church. The vehicle suddenly stops in front of the ancient temple, while a hooded figure waits patiently. A man wearing dark robes and holding a lit lantern comes out to welcome the visitors from the carriage. With a somber tone, the hooded man utters a secret phrase to initiate the forbidden negotiation. The carriage driver steps down slowly, keeping his guard up as he listens to the cult ally's password. The visitor responds with the second part of the macabre password, confirming his identity at the secret meeting. The man with the lantern nods in agreement upon noticing he is dealing with the correct partner. He orders them to bring the promised merchandise right away so they can start the terrible dark ritual. Two hooded men drag a fully tied up young boy with silver hair out of the carriage. The boy is brutally pushed by the henchmen, unable to fight back due to the ropes binding his arms. The leader questions if that fragile boy is really the noble offering that was promised for the ritual. He brings the lantern light closer to the hostage's face to personally verify the victim's identity. The man shows a deformed and scary smile while savoring the victory of that cruel kidnapping. The light-haired boy remains gagged and silent, showing no panic in front of the cultists. The kidnapper orders the servant to bring the true valuable reward that was promised in the deal right away. He arrogantly guarantees that the feared goddess of fire will welcome that noble offering with open arms. The group begins to guide the young victim into the dark interior of the religious temple, where they will perform the ritual. The elderly woman wearing a dark robe welcomes the group, stating that everything is happening according to her goddess's will. Then, she turns around and asks in a mysterious tone of voice for everyone to follow her inside the ancient temple. Randolph, disguised as the carriage driver, murmurs in disgust about the dark cult they are about to enter. He quickly corrects himself and orders in a low voice that the group keep moving forward without showing any hesitation. Kyle and Randolph walk right behind as kidnappers, escorting young Isaac, who pretends to be bound by ropes. The elderly woman extends her lit lantern to illuminate the dark path and asks again for them to follow her. The group walks down the dark and damp stone stairs that lead directly to the fanatic's underground lair. To keep up the disguise in front of the cultists, Randolph places his hand on Isaac's shoulder in a firm and authoritative way. Kyle walks while keeping a cold and focused look under the hood of his robe, fully prepared for any danger. He observes everything around him with extreme attention, knowing that a single mistake could put everyone's life at risk. The story flashes back to a few days ago, showing a hot cup of tea being served during a private conversation. Kyle asks if he was freed because of the exposure of the night's crimes, and Isaac confirms that is the plan. The young master explains that a rebellion is a serious offense, and therefore the warrior lost his leadership position. Kyle replies calmly that he didn't even know he held such an important rank in that army. He pauses briefly before bringing the cup to his lips. Intrigued by the boy's next words, Isaac asks with a friendly smile if he knows that tea, revealing that the drink is native to his homeland. The warrior looks at the drink in surprise upon realizing the young heir knows his true foreign origin. Kyle places the cup back on the table and directly questions the reason he wasn't reported to the authorities. He reminds the heir that the boy knows very well his real name isn't Carlson. Isaac confesses that he needed to keep this secret hidden so he could use his skills at the right moment. Kyle starts breaking a cold sweat at that revelation, unable to understand what that boy is planning. The young master advises the man to focus on his own goal instead of trying to guess other people's thoughts. He asks if Kyle isn't after the life of that greedy old man who destroyed the family he tried to build. Isaac reveals the target's name as Viscount Klaus von Bottmer, leaving the warrior completely shocked. Kyle asks, startled, how the boy knows this, and why he isn't trying to stop his revenge. The warrior explains that his target is an important noble in that kingdom, while he himself is just a foreigner. Isaac reveals that what he really needs is a perfect sword that possesses an iron will of its own. He promises that if the man lends him his legendary strength, he will ensure the desired revenge is carried out. Kyle stares at the young hare in silence, realizing that this is an offer for an irresistible partnership. Back in the city of Bern, a preacher yells in the middle of the street to grab the attention of all the local citizens. The fanatic man screams with all his might about the terrible threats that are plaguing the region. He warns that black magic is spreading like a plague, and that the cultists are committing cruel and unforgivable acts. The preacher orders everyone to seek salvation in faith and not in a feudal lord who merely watches everything without acting. Inside a carriage passing through the area, Kyle observes the man and comments on the fanatics of the old church. Randolph complains that the church charges heavy taxes from the family, but continues to defame the Lord of Goeth in public. Isaac interrupts the two allies' discussion, saying that this subject isn't the most important right now. Randolph asks worriedly if the young master is absolutely sure about offering himself as bait for the ritual. The hare explains that the cultists seek notoriety and that there is no more attractive bait in the north than him. Kyle warns that they have no idea of the mortal dangers awaiting them inside the lair of those fanatics. Randolph reinforces the scary rumors about cruel rituals and asks if it's really worth risking his life. Isaac ignores the warnings and questions if the old church is truly providing financial support for that dark cult. The boy's blue eyes shine with determination as he analyzes the details of the conspiracy in his mind. Kyle comments that the coins they used to bribe the guards came directly from the cursed cult's coffers. The young master agrees and confirms that this is exactly the official version they will present to the kingdom. Isaac recalls that Nier's coins were of high quality and minted by the royals, something impossible for a bandit. Randolph agrees that the origin of those gold coins is very suspicious and indicates the presence of a powerful ally. Kyle theorizes that only the old church would have this access, but questions if this proves a direct link to the cult. Isaac asks with disdain if the warrior really intends to cling to such a fragile and meaningless hope. He recalls that it was exactly around this time that the situation started getting chaotic throughout the entire Northern Territory. The Shadow Cult began destroying the region from the inside with grotesque rituals that paralyzed the people with fear. The old church was the group that profited the most from this general panic. Pretending to hunt the members of the secret cult, they would capture the supposed cultists and purge them in public fires in the middle of the village square. Upon witnessing this demonstration of supposed divine mercy, the people began to venerate the church even more. Since then, Goeth's situation became unsustainable, and the nobles began to complain about that terrible absurdity. They complained that the church doubled the tithes and even demanded soldiers for building works. While they struggled to survive, the territory began to suffer heavier and heavier financial pressures and demands coming from that old church. Because of this, the county suffered from extreme starvation, and Isaac decided it was time to break the pact with them for good. This courageous attitude would be just the first step to being able to protect the people and the territory of Goeth. Back in the dark dungeon, the elderly woman walks down the stone stairs slowly while leaning on her old cane. The elderly woman says that everything started there when the church burned the place and only 3 saints made it out of the great fire alive. She says the injured survivors saw God face to face, but Randolph just wishes she would shut her mouth once and for all. The woman continues her bizarre preaching, stating that people's souls reside directly inside human flesh. She explains that eating this flesh makes the soul be reborn in them with all the intellect and vitality of the offered person. At that moment, they spot several cultists consuming forbidden remains in a bizarre feast to achieve eternity. Randolph is completely horrified upon witnessing that disgusting, gruesome act taking place before them. The elderly woman taps her cane hard on the ground and shouts, announcing that the prophesied offering has finally arrived at the altar. The fanatics get agitated on the floor as she orders them to eat the flesh so they can become as noble and pure as the victim. With a scary smile, the old woman presents Isaac as the perfect soul that unites all the qualities for the feast. She opens her mouth in a bizarre way and orders everyone to start consuming the boy right there without any kind of mercy. Randolph loses his patience and kicks the elderly woman away, saying he can no longer listen to so much madness and nonsense. He yells in annoyance, asking Isaac how much more of that bizarre craziness they will have to endure in that hole. The knight steps forward and starts untying the fake ropes that bound his young master's arms to initiate combat. Isaac removes his gag and sighs in relief, seeing that Randolph has finally acted and taken the attitude he expected. The young master calmly orders his allies to only engage the cultists, who try to attack them first. The cultists back away in terror upon realizing the supposed victims are actually relentless warriors. Isaac seriously warns his partners not to forget the real strategic plan that led them to that location. The boy sighs in relief upon seeing that Randolph finally managed to take down the old woman and assume control of the room. The warrior takes a stance with his sword in hand and reinforces that they must only eliminate those who try to start a fight. The old woman lying on the ground screams full of hatred, promising that a terrible curse from the goddess will fall upon the invaders. Randolph interrupts her with a precise strike to the face to shut her up for good and put an end to that irritating screaming. The knight points his sharp weapon and warns the other fanatics that whoever takes a step forward will perish instantly. He guarantees with a terrifying look that he will take down any opponent before they can even feel pain. Upon hearing that terrible threat, the majority of the cultists start running in panic to try to escape from there. Randolph is slightly surprised to see the whole gang fleeing desperately through the dark corridor doors of the dungeon. The henchmen run so fast that the temple entrance is left completely empty and silent in just a few seconds of escape. Kyle asks if they should chase the fugitives, but Isaac replies that the priority right now is to search the entire area. Randolph lets out a tired sigh and concludes that this bunch of crazy fanatics is nothing but a disorganized joke. Kyle kneels beside the old lady passed out on the floor and asks calmly if she can get up on her own. The elderly woman wakes up confused, asking where she is and begging them not to hit her, leaving Kyle intrigued by her reaction. Randolph all ironically asks if the woman suddenly went senile and makes a sarcastic comment about that lady's mental state. The elderly woman begs for mercy, mistaking Isaac for a subdeacon, but the boy just calls her mom in a friendly way. The young master bends down patiently with a gentle smile and asks where this elderly lady's real residence is. A short time later, the group arrives at the humble wooden cabin located in the slums south of the great city of Bern. As they enter the residence and look at the attic, the knights are paralyzed with shock at what they just found. Before them appears a chest overflowing with a massive pile of gleaming, high-quality silver coins. They find it unbelievable that such a poor and humble lady kept such a huge fortune hidden in her attic. Randolph pushes his greedy partner away and asks if they are sure that this money belongs to the royals. Isaac gives a positive nod, confirming that his loyal knight Randolph's suspicion is correct. The boy analyzes the coin very closely and guarantees that the official seal engraved on the metal belongs to the royal mint. He celebrates that they got the proof linking the cult to the church, but is interrupted by knocks on the door and a voice calling. Suddenly, the cabin door opens and someone announces out loud that they are entering the humble room. The newcomer's voice echoes through the house as he kindly asks if the elderly lady is feeling well. Upstairs, Isaac widens his eyes in complete shock upon recognizing whose voice that is. The boy immediately realizes the person who just walked in is actually actually an influential cleric from the old church. With a discreet smile on his face, the man asks in a friendly tone if the ritual was a great success. Sitting on the bed, the elderly woman breaks into a cold sweat and hesitates to answer the man before her. Trying to hide her immense panic, she starts shaking completely and tries to mumble a few disconnected words to deflect the visitor's attention. With her eyes wide in panic, she stammers, terrified, and claims that demons invaded the temple and ruined everything. The woman reveals loudly that cruel creatures desecrated the sacred altar and wiped out all the cult's devotees. In a panic, she begs for a divine miracle, while the cleric gets confused and demands a clear explanation about the demons. Barely able to breathe, she tries to fake madness by calling the man a subdeacon and making up an absurd story in the room. The lady cries profusely on the bed, claiming her husband is beating her, and begs desperately for help. The cleric sighs impatiently upon seeing the dramatic scene, deducing that the old lady has lost her mind for good. However, a slight wooden noise coming from the attic catches the man's attention and puts him on immediate alert. He turns around quickly with a suspicious look toward the wooden stairs leading up to the attic. The cleric observes the top of the stairs in the darkness, suspecting that someone might be hiding up there. The man charges magical energy in his hand and coldly warns that he has noticed the presence of intruders in the residence. He concludes in his thoughts that the old lady is no longer useful and that their secret can never be revealed. Thus, he plans to burn the evidence of his corruption, along with all the wealth accumulated in that filthy attic. Kyle observes the threat from above and warns that the real demons usually hide behind holy light. In the blink of an eye, Kyle appears behind the cleric with his sharp blade pressed against the traitor's neck. Trembling and sweating in terror, the cleric tries to threaten the warrior, warning that the Vatican will avenge his demise. Isaac starts walking down the wooden steps calmly, commenting that he finally remembered the man's identity. The young master flashes a smirk and greets the traitor in a cynical way as he approaches in the living room. Time jumps to the next morning in the imposing city cathedral, where the subdeacon appears tied up and captured, bound to a wooden chair with heavy ropes. The corrupt cleric no longer has any way to escape from there. Crying in despair, the prisoner starts to confess that the old church wanted to expand its influence in the territory. He reveals that, to achieve this goal, the bishop ordered them to create a fictional villain for the people to fear. For this, the man created a new doctrine and incited the needy wanderers to found that terrible cult. The subdeacon admits with bitterness that it was this conspiracy that gave rise to the terrible cult that terrorized the region. Randolph comments indignantly that this was the worst confession he has ever heard and asks what they will do next. Isaac maintains a cold and thoughtful expression, knowing this confession is the card he needed for the game. The boy decides that the advisor's chiller will take the prisoner to cathedral so they can begin official negotiations. The tied-up cleric spits on the ground and laughs, saying that the bishop will surely punish the family severely. Suddenly, the prisoner's eyes widen in terror as he notices a grave danger approaching in the darkness. Isaac stares at him extremely coldly, completely unfazed by the traitor's desperate threats. The subdeacon lowers his head in defeat, noticing that his tragic fate has already been completely sealed by the boy. Night falls over the territory, and the dark sky brings an atmosphere of mystery and imminent danger to the events. In the silent dungeon, a lone candle burns and casts flickering shadows against the cold stone wall. Slow and mysterious footsteps begin to echo through the corridor as a hooded figure approaches the cell. The tied-up cleric breaks a cold sweat, thinking that his entire plan crumbled in just a single night. Because of a child, Isaac appears in the shadows, observing the prisoner enigmatically and without showing any initial reaction. Suddenly, an unbearable and sharp pain hits the subdeacon's chest, making him let out a groan of pure suffering. Spitting blood, the man smiles in a macabre way and mocks, saying the young hare is just the offspring of savages. The prisoner guarantees that divine justice justice will fall upon Isaac's sins before taking his final breath. He feels his strength fade as he babbles that the bishop will surely bring the punishment the boy so deserves. With a look full of madness and hatred, the man spends his last bit of energy cursing the entire Goa-the bloodline. The cleric looks at his own pierced chest in shock, unable to believe that his time is running out. He lets out one last groan of agony as his mysterious, hooded assailant turns to leave. The mysterious figure who eliminated the subdeacon walks with cold and silent steps out of the dungeons. However, heavy footsteps block his escape route, and a firm voice asks if the invader is already leaving. Isaac appears imposing at the dungeon entrance, holding a lit lantern to block the assailant's exit. The hooded assailant stops, walking immediately upon realizing he fell into the boy's perfect trap. Isaac smiles coldly in the darkness, commenting that it is a shame they had to meet in such a tragic way. The young hare reveals the true identity of the hooded assailant, calling the man Bishop Livonius,